Hey dreamers, tonight we descend into the depths few souls ever dared to enter. The hidden pit of Tartarus, the Greek underworld's darkest and most mysterious domain. You will walk its corridors not as a condemned spirit, but as a silent guest, granted a passage through shadows where even legends trembled, guided by ancient wisdom through the very architecture of divine justice. We think of Tartarus as the hellish prison for the worst mortal sinners. But what if I told you that wasn't its original purpose at all? What cosmic war led to its creation, and who were its very first divine prisoners? How does this forgotten history add a deeper, more complex meaning to the punishments we thought we knew? As you cross the threshold of this place carved from pure darkness, you sense time itself start to drift. Here, mercy is a stranger, and every punishment unfolds with haunting precision. If these stories truly help you relax, feel free to leave a gentle like. If you'd like, you're welcome to share in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you now. Tonight, you're among fellow dreamers, exploring the boundaries of justice, fate, and myth. Tonight, your guide speaks in whispers that sound like distant wind echoing through stone corridors. You never truly see this presence, but you feel it close, a companion who knows the way as you begin your descent. With each step downwards, the world above fades quickly, and the air thickens with memories of ancient sorrow. This journey, called katabasis by the Greeks, was rarely taken by the living, and tonight you are unusually privileged to witness what lies concealed below. Every detail you encounter is shaped by centuries of fear, longing, and divine imagination. You begin your descent through layers of earth and winding stone, following narrow passageways that pull you deeper into realms where sunlight cannot reach. The temperature doesn't really drop or rise, it shifts into something stagnant and ancient, as if the very air had been breathing and recycling itself for millennia. Your footsteps make no sound against the smooth stone beneath. Their silence echoes with the passage of uncounted souls before you, gone but never quite forgotten. The walls seem to drink in the faint light, polished obsidian soft beneath your fingers, shifting almost like a veil between this world and something unimaginable. Pay close attention to this descent, to the unnatural silence and the endless stone. This is not a natural cavern, but an architecture of consequence, built to contain something far older than mortal sin. We will soon discover what cosmic law was broken to require such a prison, and for whom it was truly built. But its story is told in its very foundations, and so we must journey deeper before it can be revealed. As you travel further, the most persistent and haunting sound emerges, the rushing of water, not a single stream but many, their voices weaving together a harmony of sorrow, oaths, and forgetting. In myth, the Greeks believed that 5 great rivers carved this realm, each flowing with its own burden and promise. The first river to greet you is the Acheron, river of woe. Its waters glimmer dark as tarnished silver under a sky more timeless than memory. Approaching the Acheron, you feel its current tug at your thoughts, drawing you into a tide of regret and longing that has carried countless souls. You stand now where untold mortals have waited, gazing into mists that hover above the surface, each breath infused with fragments of stories unfulfilled. The river is wider than you imagined, its distant shore lost in a haze that feels like the size of sleeping giants. Listen carefully. The whispers in the mist are the laments of those unable to pay the ferryman's price. In life, Greeks placed coins on the eyes, or in the mouths of their dead, payment for Charon, who has ferried travellers since before the gods ruled Olympus. From the shifting mist, Charon's boat materializes, a vessel older than empires, its wood weathered, seemingly untouched by decay. Charon stands at the stern, a figure sculpted from the same time-worn stone as the underworld itself. His face is caught between ageless patience and exhaustion, his eyes hollow yet alert. He doesn't greet you or demand payment. Your silent guide has settled the fare, allowing you to cross. Charon poles his craft with a fluidity that hints at thousands of years of repetition, a ritual never interrupted. The crossing is silent, save for the gentle lap of water against the boat's hull. You look down into the Acheron's depths and see, or perhaps imagine you see, faces forming in the dark currents, mouths opening in silent cries, hands reaching upward from depths that may or may not be bottomless. Charon pays them no mind, he's seen this display for eons, and his task is only to ferry, not to rescue, not to judge, simply to transport from one shore to another. This river of woe is only the first emotional boundary we will cross. Every river in this realm has a purpose, but they all lead to one inevitable centre, an abyss whose true origins lie not in sin, but in divine politics. Let us continue, for to understand that prison, we must first navigate the very geography of sorrow. It's a role that might seem humble, yet it carries a terrible power. He is the gatekeeper between worlds, and his refusal to take a soul across condemns them to wander as ghosts, trapped between life and death. A reminder that even the smallest cog in the divine machinery can wield authority beyond mortal comprehension. The far shore rises before you, and as the boat touches land, you step onto soil that has never known sunlight, never felt rain, never been trodden by anything living save for the rare hero or fool who dared the descent. Before you loom gates of bronze and iron, massive beyond practical necessity, clearly designed to impress upon arrivals the finality of their journey. And there, sprawled before these gates with the languid menace of a creature entirely secure in its domain, lies Cerberus. The three-headed hound of Hades is larger than any living dog, each of his heads the size of a lion's, and his body ripples with muscle beneath skin as dark as volcanic rock. Serpents writhe in his mane, their scales catching what little light exists in this place, and his tail ends not in fur but in another serpent's head, alert and watchful. All 6 eyes, 3 pairs in 3 heads, fix upon you as you approach, and a low rumble emanates from 3 throats simultaneously, a sound that vibrates in your chest and makes your bones ache with its bass resonance. Yet he does not attack. He knows, somehow, that you're not meant to be here as prey, but as witness. Perhaps he smells the mark your guide has placed upon you, or perhaps even Cerberus grows bored with eternity and welcomes the novelty of a living visitor. Honestly, which mythological creature do you find most fascinating in their role? For me, it has to be Cerberus, because there's something profoundly lonely about being the eternal gatekeeper, powerful beyond measure yet completely constrained by duty, never able to leave your post even for a moment. The original security guard, working a shift that will never end. You pass the hound with a mixture of awe and relief, and beyond the gates the landscape of the underworld opens before you. This is not yet Tartarus. You're still in the outer regions where souls gather for judgment, but already you can sense the organization of this realm, the terrible bureaucracy of death. Ahead, you see 3 figures seated upon thrones of dark stone, their positions arranged in a semicircle, as if preparing to hear a case in court. These are the judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iarchus, demigods appointed by Zeus himself to determine the eternal fate of every soul that enters the underworld. Minos sits in the centre, his bearing regal even in death, for he was once king of Crete and lawgiver to a mighty civilization. To his right sits Rhadamanthus, known in life for his unfailing integrity, his judgment so fair that even the gods consulted him in matters of dispute. And to Minos' left, Iarchus, who holds the keys to the underworld itself, keeper of its deepest secrets and darkest places. They do not look up as you pass. They're occupied with a newly arrived soul, a shade so recently dead that it still tries to gesture with hands that are no longer quite solid, pleading a case in the desperate hope of avoiding the worst fate. You cannot hear the verdict, but you see the shade's shoulders slump, and 2 figures materialize beside it. The Furies, winged and terrible, ready to escort another damned soul to its eternal punishment. The Furies, or Erinyes as the Greeks also called them, are daughters of the primordial darkness, spirits of vengeance older than the Olympian gods. They have the wings of bats, faces that shift between beautiful and terrible, and eyes that burn with the accumulated rage of every unpunished crime in mortal history. They are Tartarus's enforcers, the ones who ensure that punishment, once decreed, is carried out with absolute precision. You watch them lead the shade away, toward a distant darkness that seems to pull at the edges of vision, and you understand with sudden clarity that you're about to follow that same path. Your guide's presence intensifies beside you, a cold reassurance that you remain protected even as you venture into realms meant only for the damned. The path slopes downward once more, and the quality of darkness changes. If the outer underworld was dim, this is something else entirely, a darkness that feels alive, that presses against your skin and whispers in languages older than Greek, older than any human tongue. The very air grows heavy with the weight of accumulated suffering, and you catch scents that make no sense. Stone somehow smells like tears here, and the distant sound of flowing water carries notes of molten metal and despair. This is the descent to Tartarus proper, the deepest pit of the underworld, located, as Homer's Zeus proclaimed, as far beneath Hades as the heavens are above the earth. The architecture of this place defies normal geometry. Passages seem to curve both inward and outward simultaneously. Stairs descend while feeling like they climb, and the ceiling, when you can make it out at all, appears to be simultaneously close enough to touch and infinitely distant. It's as if the laws of physical reality fray at the edges here, unable to maintain their structure in a place designed to house the impossible, the eternal punishment of those who challenged the gods themselves. You pass through a final archway, and before you spreads the terrible landscape of Tartarus. The scale of it staggers comprehension. It extends in all directions farther than mortal eyes can perceive, a vast plain of dark stone interrupted by pools of shadow and pillars of what might be rock or might be something else entirely. Flames flicker in the distance, but they cast no warmth, only a sickly greenish light that makes everything it touches look diseased. And everywhere you hear them, the sounds of the punished, groans of effort, cries of anguish, the rumble of rolling stone, the splash of water that accomplishes nothing, the screech of wheels that turn without end. The river Phlegethon flows through Tartarus, a torrent of liquid fire that provides the only real illumination in this place. Its flames dance and leap, casting shadows that move independently of their sources, and the heat it radiates is not the clean heat of a hearth fire, but something corrupt, something that burns without purifying. Your guide steers you around its banks, and you're grateful, even though you know intellectually that you cannot be harmed here, that your protection is absolute. The instinct to avoid such flames runs deeper than reason. We approach our first subject now, and you hear him before you see him, the sound of enormous weight scraping against stone, the grunt of effort, the brief moment of silence, and then the thunderous crash as stone meets stone, and the cycle begins anew. Sisyphus, once king of Corinth, once the cleverest man in all of Greece, performs his eternal labor. The hill rises before you, steep enough that climbing it without burden would be challenging. But Sisyphus carries a burden unlike any mortal ever bore, a boulder of grey granite, perfectly round and massive, easily twice the height of a man. The boulder seems to glow with a faint inner light, a curse woven into its very substance by Hades himself, ensuring that it can never, ever reach the summit. Sisyphus himself is muscled like no mortal was in life, his body transformed by countless eons of pushing that stone, every fibre of his being now devoted to this singular, pointless task. You watch as he positions himself beneath the boulder, his shoulders taking the weight, his legs bracing against the slope. The muscles in his back stand out like cables as he begins to push, and the boulder, with terrible slowness, begins to move upward. One step, another, each one a victory against weight and gravity and the fundamental resistance of the universe to his progress. Sweat streams down his face, though he's long past actual physical exhaustion. This is the memory of sweat, the eternal repetition of a body's response to impossible effort. His eyes are fixed upward, always on that summit, always on the goal he will never reach, and in them you see something that might be hope, or might be madness, or perhaps in this place they amount to the same thing. The ancient Greeks would tell you that Sisyphus earned this fate through cleverness turned to wickedness. He violated the sacred laws of hospitality, murdering guests who sought shelter under his roof. He betrayed Zeus by revealing the king of gods' secret affair to a wronged father. But his greatest crime, the one that sealed his fate, was his audacity in twice cheating death itself. When Thanatos, the embodiment of death, came for him, Sisyphus trapped the god in chains, and suddenly, across the entire mortal world, nothing could die. Warriors fought battles where no one fell, the sick lingered in agony without release, and the natural order unraveled. When Ares, god of war, finally freed Thanatos, for what's the point of war without death, Sisyphus was dragged to the underworld at last. But clever Sisyphus had planned even for this. He instructed his wife to deny him proper funeral rites, leaving his body unburied and unmourned. When he arrived in the underworld, he went straight to Persephone, queen of the dead, and complained about this disrespect. He begged for just 3 days in the mortal world to arrange his own funeral and punish his negligent wife. Persephone, moved by what seemed like proper concern for ritual, granted his request. And of course, once back in the sunlight, Sisyphus had no intention of returning. He lived out a full natural lifespan before age finally accomplished what death could not, and brought him back to face the wrath of both Hades and Zeus. For such presumption, for daring to think himself cleverer than death itself, Sisyphus received his boulder. The punishment is perfectly calibrated, you realize, as you watch him struggle upward. It gives him hope, the summit is visible, theoretically achievable, and sometimes he gets so close that he can see over its edge. For one glorious moment, he thinks this time it will be different. And then the enchantment woven into the stone activates, and no matter how firmly he braces, no matter how desperately he grips, the boulder tears free of his grasp and thunders back down the slope to settle at the bottom, waiting patiently for him to descend and begin again. You watch Sisyphus make his descent, and there's something almost mechanical about it now. The way he walks back down to the boulder, the way he positions himself, the way he begins to push. How many times has he done this? Millions, billions. The Greeks had no number large enough to quantify eternity, and so neither do we. It's a labor that would break any mortal mind in days, but Sisyphus is no longer mortal, and his mind cannot break, it can only endure, forever aware, forever hoping, forever disappointed. A reminder that sometimes the god's cruelty lies not in destruction, but in preservation, keeping you whole enough to suffer completely. Honestly, if you had to face an eternal task, which would you choose? For me, it would have to be something with at least some variation, because the pure repetition of Sisyphus's boulder, the exact same motions for eternity, seems like a special kind of madness. Though I suppose that's rather the point. We move on, leaving Sisyphus to his mountain, and the landscape of Tartarus shifts around us. Distance has no fixed meaning here. Places are separated not by miles, but by the severity of crimes that earned their inhabitants' presence. You find yourself approaching a region where the air, if it can be called air, carries the scent of fruit that never ripens and water that never quenches. This is the domain of Tantalus, and his punishment is considered by many to be the most psychologically torturous of all Tartarus's carefully crafted hells. Tantalus stands in a pool of crystal-clear water, the surface reaching his chin. Above his head hangs the branch of a magnificent tree, heavy with fruit so perfect it looks like it was crafted by divine hands rather than grown, which, in a sense, it was. Pears and apples, grapes and pomegranates, figs split open to reveal their sweet red interior, all of it just barely out of reach. And Tantalus, king who once dined at the table of the gods, starves. You observe him as thirst overcomes him, a thirst that has been building for eons without relief. He bends his head, mouth opening to drink from the water that surrounds him, and the instant his lips would touch the surface, the water recedes. It drains away as if pulled by invisible drains, leaving him standing on muddy ground, the water level dropping to his knees, then his ankles, then disappearing entirely. For a moment he stands there, mouth still open in the motion of drinking, and then, with the terrible patience of the repeatedly disappointed, he straightens. And as he does, the water returns, rising around his legs, his waist, his chest, his shoulders, stopping exactly at his chin once more, forever offering what it will never provide. The thirst, you understand, is not mild. It's the thirst of a man who has been dying of thirst for thousands upon thousands of years, whose throat feels like it's lined with sand, whose tongue has forgotten what moisture feels like. It's a thirst that would drive any mortal to insanity within hours. But Tantalus is not allowed insanity, he's kept in perfect, terrible awareness of his suffering. When thirst grows too overwhelming to bear, he sometimes tries for the fruit instead. You watch as he reaches upward, his hand extending toward a perfect pear, fingers stretching for the promise of juice and sweetness. The branch seems within reach. He calculates the distance with eyes that have made this calculation infinite times before, and he judges he can grasp it. But as his fingers draw near, a wind rises from nowhere, a wind that exists only for this purpose, and it pushes the branch away, lifting it just beyond his grasp. He stretches further, standing on his toes, and the branch rises higher, maintaining its exact distance, forever close, forever impossible. The hunger Tantalus suffers is equal to his thirst, a gnawing emptiness that has forgotten the meaning of satisfaction. He can remember food, that's part of his torture. He remembers the taste of roasted meat and fresh bread, of wine and honey, remembers it all with perfect clarity, but hasn't tasted any of it since the day his crimes were discovered. And what crimes they were! Tantalus was the son of Zeus, a demigod granted privileges beyond normal mortal scope. He was invited to dine on Olympus with the gods themselves, to share their ambrosia and nectar, to sit as a near equal among the most powerful beings in existence. But Tantalus's gratitude expressed itself in peculiar ways. He stole portions of ambrosia and nectar, smuggling divine food to his mortal friends to show off his connections. Worse, he gossiped about the gods' private affairs, turning their secrets into dinner-party entertainment. But these crimes, serious as they were, paled beside his ultimate transgression. To test whether the gods were truly all-knowing, whether their claims of omniscience were genuine or mere boasting, Tantalus committed an act so horrific it makes even the other punishments of Tartarus seem measured by comparison. He murdered his own son Pelops, butchered the boy's body, cooked it, and served it to the gods as a feast. It was filicide and attempted deicide wrapped into one monstrous act, seeking to prove gods could be deceived while demonstrating the most profound violation of natural law. The gods, of course, knew instantly what was set before them, all except Demeter, who, distracted by grief over her missing daughter Persephone, absently ate a portion of Pelops' shoulder before realizing what she was consuming. The Olympians immediately reassembled Pelops, restoring him to life and replacing his consumed shoulder with one crafted from ivory. But for Tantalus there could be no mercy, no second chance, no clever escape. Zeus himself designed the punishment, and it's a masterwork of psychological torture. Tantalus is surrounded by abundance, by food and drink that would end his suffering instantly, but it exists in a state of permanent promise, never quite becoming reality. The pool and the fruit tree are real. They're not illusions, which somehow makes it worse. The water is genuinely cool and clean, the fruit genuinely ripe and sweet, but the enchantment prevents any possibility of consumption. It's the punishment of false hope, of seeing salvation clearly while being fundamentally unable to reach it. The gods even gave us a word for this particular agony, to tantalize, to torment with the sight of something desired but unattainable. Some accounts add another layer to his torment, a massive stone suspended above his head by invisible threads, always threatening to fall, never quite falling. This stone represents not just physical danger, but the weight of guilt, the crushing awareness of what he did, balanced precariously above him for all eternity. It's almost redundant, given the sophistication of his primary punishment, but the gods were apparently in a thorough mood when dealing with Tantalus. A reminder that divine project management sometimes involves a certain amount of creative overkill. You notice something else as you observe Tantalus, his eyes. They track every movement of the water, every sway of the fruit branches, calculating, measuring, hoping that perhaps this time the pattern will break, that perhaps after enough eons the enchantment will weaken. But it won't. Curses laid by Zeus himself don't fade with time. Tantalus will stand in that pool beneath that tree until the cosmos itself unravels, and perhaps even then his punishment will continue in whatever comes after. The landscape shifts again as your guide leads you onward. You're moving deeper into Tartarus now, toward regions where the punishments take on more active, more violent forms. The air grows thick with the smell of burning, not the clean smell of a cooking fire, but something acrid and wrong, like metal heated beyond its melting point. And you hear a sound that raises the hair on your neck, the steady spinning of a wheel combined with what might be screaming, or might be wind rushing through a tunnel, or might be both. Ixion's punishment comes into view, and it's a spectacle of motion and flame that seems designed as much for display as for suffering. The wheel stands upright, easily 20 feet in diameter, made of some dark metal that drinks in light rather than reflecting it. And bound to it, spread-eagled, is Ixion, once king of the Lapiths, his body stretched across the wheel's surface. The wheel spins, fast enough that individual details blur, and as it turns, it trails fire like a comet streaking through the sky of Tartarus. The flames are not natural fire. They don't consume Ixion or the wheel itself, but they burn nonetheless, searing without destroying, causing agony without offering the release of death. Around and around Ixion goes, trapped in perpetual revolution, and you realize with a kind of horrified fascination that his perspective must be utterly disorienting. The world spins past at tremendous speed, moments of clarity where he sees the landscape of Tartarus, interspersed with moments where he sees only the flames that trail his passage, and then darkness, and then Tartarus again, over and over without pause, without rest, forever. Ixion's crimes began with murder, though in the morality of ancient Greece there were murders and then there were murders. He killed his father-in-law Erinyes, and not in honourable combat, but through treachery. Ixion had promised Erinyes rich bride gifts for his daughter Dia's hand in marriage, but when the time came to pay, Ixion decided the gifts were better kept than given. When Erinyes came to collect what was owed, Ixion invited him to feast, then arranged for the old man to fall into a concealed pit filled with burning coals. It was murder by hospitality perverted, one of the gravest sins in Greek culture, and Ixion found himself shunned by all, unable to find anyone willing to purify him of his guilt. Then Zeus, for reasons the myths never quite explain satisfactorily, perhaps the king of gods was in a merciful mood, perhaps he saw potential in Ixion, perhaps he simply acted on divine whim, took pity on the murderer. Zeus himself purified Ixion of his crime and even invited him to dine on Olympus, granting him a seat at the table of the gods. It was an extraordinary act of divine grace, a second chance that any mortal should have treasured beyond all else. Ixion responded by attempting to seduce Hera, the queen of the gods, Zeus's own wife. The sheer audacity of it still astounds, to receive forgiveness for murder from the most powerful being in existence, and to repay that mercy by pursuing his wife. Zeus, upon learning of Ixion's intentions, could have simply destroyed him. A thunderbolt would have solved the problem instantly. But Zeus was, when he chose to be, more subtle than that, and he decided that Ixion deserved not destruction but revelation and punishment perfectly suited to his crime. Zeus shaped a cloud into perfect likeness of Hera, this cloud woman named Nephele, and sent her to Ixion to test whether his lustful intentions were genuine. Ixion, oblivious to the deception or simply too consumed by desire to care, made love to the cloud, Hera, and from that union came Centaurus, the first of the centaurs. In some versions of the myth, this is punishment enough to father a race of wild, chaotic creatures who would plague humanity for generations, but Zeus decided Ixion merited something more personal, more direct. Hermes, messenger of the gods and guide of souls, was tasked with preparing Ixion's eternal punishment. He forged the wheel, binding Ixion to it with chains that could never break, and set it spinning in the depths of Tartarus. The wheel represents betrayal's endless cycle, lust that never satisfies, ambition that destroys itself, and the fundamental futility of trying to possess what was never meant to be yours. Ixion pursued Hera, Queen of Heaven, and now he spins through a realm where heaven is forever out of reach, able to see it in flashes as the wheel rotates but never able to approach it. You watch the wheel spin, trying to catch a glimpse of Ixion's face as it whirls past, and for just a moment, you succeed. His expression is not what you expected. It's not anguish or regret, but a kind of fierce concentration, as if even now, after eons of spinning, he's trying to figure out how to escape, how to stop the wheel. Perhaps cleverness, like hope, dies hard in Tartarus, or perhaps it never dies at all, which is the cruelest joke of all. The landscape changes once more, and you find yourself approaching a region where the ground itself seems to pulse with pain. This is where Tychos suffers, and the scale of his punishment reflects the scale of his body, for Tychos was a giant born from the earth itself when Zeus hid his mother Elara beneath the ground to conceal yet another affair from Hera. The god's marital problems, one might observe, generated a truly impressive amount of collateral damage over the centuries. Olympian relationship counseling was clearly not a thriving field. Tychos lies stretched across the landscape, his body pegged to the ground with stakes the size of tree trunks, covering, according to Homer, 9 acres of Tartarus's dark soil. And upon his exposed abdomen, 2 vultures the size of small houses crouch, their beaks buried in his regenerating liver. You hear the wet sound of tearing flesh, the cries of the birds as they feast, and beneath it all, a low moan from Tychos himself, a sound that seems to come from the earth as much as from his throat. The liver was significant to ancient Greeks. They believed it to be the seat of passion, desire, and emotion, the organ where feelings lived before the brain was properly understood. So to have your liver eternally devoured wasn't just physical torture, it was the consumption of your emotional core, your capacity for desire literally eaten away only to regenerate so it could be eaten away again. The punishment continues day after day, night after night, though, of course, Tartarus has no actual day or night, only the endless grinding eternity of suffering. Tychios's crime was, like so many in Tartarus, a crime of lust directed at someone fundamentally off-limits. He attempted to rape Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, as she traveled to Delphi. Some myths suggest Hera encouraged this assault, using the giant as a weapon against yet another of Zeus's lovers, but encouragement from a goddess doesn't excuse the attempt. Apollo and Artemis, protective of their mother and rightfully enraged, struck Tychos down with their arrows before his assault could be completed. Zeus himself may have delivered the killing blow with a thunderbolt. Either way, Tychos died, but his punishment was only beginning. You observe the vultures at their work, noting how they don't simply tear randomly but seem to follow a pattern, consuming the liver in a specific sequence that maximizes pain while ensuring it regenerates properly for the next day's feast. These are not natural birds, they're instruments of divine justice, created or tasked specifically for this punishment, and they perform their duty with the same inexorable patience Charon shows at his ferry or Cerberus at his gate. The thought occurs to you that perhaps the entire underworld is one vast machine of consequences, each component playing its assigned role in demonstrating that certain actions carry prices that must be paid, no matter how long it takes, no matter how much it hurts. Tychios himself seems barely conscious, his awareness reduced to a dim sense of pain and violation that renews itself with each sunrise that he cannot see. Perhaps that's a mercy, to be lost in suffering rather than acutely aware of it, though it seems more likely that even this dulled awareness is part of the punishment, a reminder that some crimes reduce you to less than yourself, strip away everything except the consequences of what you did. Think about the moral lessons embedded in these punishments, what they say about what ancient Greeks valued most. For me, it's fascinating how hospitality violations keep appearing, because in our modern world, that doesn't quite carry the same weight, yet for the Greeks, betraying a guest or host was almost worse than murder. Cultural context changes everything. We move deeper still, and now the architecture of Tartarus begins to show structure, organization. You see what appear to be temples or monuments, buildings carved from the living rock of this place, their purposes unclear but their presence suggesting that even here there's hierarchy, there's order. Your guide leads you toward a courtyard where you see not one figure but many, moving in an endless procession that leads nowhere. These are the Danaids, the 49 sisters who murdered their husbands on their wedding night, and their punishment is both simpler and more psychologically complex than those we've seen before. They carry large jars, amphoras designed to hold water for household use, and they walk from a pool toward what appears to be a massive storage vessel, a pithos large enough to hold a palace's water supply. They move with the efficiency of long practice, filling their jars at the pool, carrying them to the pithos, pouring the water in, returning to the pool over and over. Except the jars are riddled with holes. You can see water streaming from them as the women walk, creating puddles that evaporate instantly in Tartarus's strange atmosphere, and by the time they reach the pithos, their jars are empty. But they pour anyway, tilting the vessels as if they contained something, then turning back to fill them again. It's a punishment of futility, like Sisyphus's boulder but multiplied by 49, a collective futility where the sisters can see each other's failure, can witness the pointlessness of their labor reflected in 48 other women's faces. The story of the Danaids is one of the more complex in Greek mythology, touching on themes of family loyalty, honor, and the impossible positions women could be forced into by male authority. Their father, Danaus, fled Egypt with his 50 daughters to escape his brother Egyptus, who wanted to marry his 50 sons to Danaus's 50 daughters. The marriages were meant to unite the families, but Danaus suspected his brother of plotting to kill him and claim everything for himself. When Egyptus's sons pursued them to Argos and demanded the marriages proceed, Danaus publicly agreed, but privately ordered his daughters to kill their new husbands on their wedding night. 49 obeyed, driving daggers through their sleeping husbands' hearts and bringing the heads to their father as proof. Only one, Hypermnestra, refused, sparing her husband Lynceus because he had respected her desire to remain a virgin. For that mercy, Danaus imprisoned her and put her on trial, though she was eventually freed and reconciled with Lynceus. The punishment of the Danaids raises uncomfortable questions about divine justice. They were following their father's commands, operating in a cultural context where daughters obeyed fathers absolutely, yet they were condemned to Tartarus alongside those who acted from pure malice. Some versions of the myth suggest the Danaids were eventually purified and released, but here in Tartarus you see them still carrying their leaking jars, still caught in the eternal repetition of labor that accomplishes nothing. You watch them work, noting the blank expressions on their faces, the mechanical nature of their movements. They've been doing this so long that it's become automatic, their minds perhaps gone elsewhere to cope with the sheer meaninglessness of the task. Or perhaps they're still hoping, after all this time, that one day the jars will hold water, that one day the pithos will fill, and they can rest. Hope, you're beginning to understand, is perhaps Tartarus's cruelest joke, because it keeps the punished engaged in their suffering, always thinking that relief might come, always being proven wrong. The landscape ripples around you, and you sense you're approaching something different, a punishment that operates on principles slightly removed from the others. The air here tastes of metal and lightning, and you smell the peculiar ozone scent that accompanies divine power in its rawest form. Your guide's presence intensifies, becoming almost protective, and you understand you're about to witness something that, even by Tartarus's standards, is extraordinary. You see chains first, massive links of adamantine, the unbreakable metal forged in the heart of Tartarus itself, stretching from floor to ceiling and beyond. And bound in those chains, positioned so he's neither standing nor lying, but suspended in permanent discomfort, is a figure whose very presence seems to radiate defiance. This is not Prometheus, you know that much. Prometheus suffered his liver punishment on a mountain in the mortal world, bound to rock while an eagle ate his regenerating liver for giving fire to humanity. But the resemblance to Prometheus's fate is intentional, a reminder that certain crimes against the divine order earn certain specific punishments, and that the gods have a sense of poetic justice that borders on obsessive. Actually, this section is where Salmoneus might appear, or where you might observe the Titans themselves, still imprisoned in the deepest part of Tartarus, or you might see one of the other lesser-known punished souls whose stories have been mostly lost to time. The ancient sources mention dozens of figures condemned to Tartarus, some for crimes as specific as stealing sacred objects, others for more nebulous offences against divine dignity. Each punishment was custom designed, each reflected the particular nature of the crime, and each was eternal. You realize something as you walk through this hall of the damned: the punishments aren't just about making the guilty suffer. They're demonstrations, object lessons in what happens when mortals forget their place, when they treat gods as equals or rivals, when they let cleverness overcome wisdom or lust overcome sense or pride overcome gratitude. Every soul here had a choice, every crime was voluntary, and every consequence was, in the gods' view, perfectly just. But there's something else too, something your guide doesn't say, but you sense in the very structure of this place. These punishments are eternal because the gods need them to be, because power must occasionally demonstrate itself to remain power, because the cosmic order requires enforcement. Tartarus exists not just to punish the wicked, but to terrify the living, to create stories that mothers tell children and that priests proclaim in temples, stories that remind everyone that divine justice, though sometimes slow, is absolutely inescapable. The philosophical implications ripple through your mind as you walk. The ancient Greeks didn't believe in an all-loving God or in redemption through repentance. Their gods were powerful, often petty, capable of both tremendous kindness and equally tremendous cruelty, and they demanded respect above all else. These punishments weren't designed to reform the punished. Sisyphus will never learn from his boulder. Tantalus will never regret his crimes enough to be freed. Ixion's wheel will spin until the end of time regardless of his remorse. The point isn't rehabilitation, it's demonstration, consequence, the proof that actions matter and some actions matter forever. You pass by other figures, some you recognize from myths half-remembered, others completely unknown to you. There's a man trying to weave a rope from straw, but chickens eat it as fast as he can plait it, his labor constantly undone by forces he cannot control. There's a woman reaching for food that transforms to stone the moment she touches it, starving in the midst of apparent abundance. There are souls crushed under rocks, burned by flames that never consume, frozen in ice that never numbs, each punishment precisely calibrated to the crime that earned it. And then you come to the center of Tartarus, or what feels like the center, a vast open space where the darkness seems to congeal into something almost solid. Here, imprisoned in chains that make the others look like string, are the Titans themselves, the old gods who ruled before Zeus and his siblings overthrew them. Cronus, who devoured his children to prevent the prophecy of his overthrow, now himself devoured by time's passage with no progress to show for it. Atlas, who led the Titans' rebellion, forced to hold up the sky for eternity, though some myths place him in a different location. The others, whose names have mostly been forgotten by the mortal world but who remain here, paying the price for losing a war against the inevitable. The Titans don't speak, don't move, except for the smallest necessary adjustments to maintain their positions. They've been here since before humans developed writing, before cities rose, before agriculture, since the very dawn of what mortals call civilization. And they'll be here long after that civilization falls, after the last human speaks the last word of Greek, after the final temple to Zeus crumbles into dust. They're beyond punishment now, in a sense. They've become part of the structure of Tartarus itself, load-bearing elements in the architecture of cosmic justice. Your guide turns you away from the Titans, and you sense your tour approaching its conclusion. You've seen what you came to see, witnessed the fates of those who challenged divine order and lost. But before you depart, your guide shows you one final thing, a vista that reveals the full scope of Tartarus. From this vantage point, you can see the entire realm spread out below you, a vast bowl of darkness studded with points of suffering, each one a soul enduring its customized torment. The geography makes a kind of terrible sense now. The worst punishments placed deepest, the lesser ones closer to the surface, everything arranged in concentric circles of culpability. It's a system, a machine, an engine of consequence powered by divine will and mortal transgression. And here's what strikes you most forcefully. It's not empty. Despite being thousands of years old, despite the countless souls who have passed through Hades' realm, Tartarus is not crowded with the damned. Most souls, the vast majority, go to the asphodel meadows, that grey space of forgetting where the neither good nor evil spend eternity in peaceful monotony. Some few, the heroes and the especially righteous, reach Elysium's blessed fields. But Tartarus? Tartarus holds only those whose crimes were so extraordinary, whose hubris so extreme, whose violation so fundamental that the normal cycle of death couldn't accommodate them. It's a filtering system, you realize, one that catches only the worst, the most egregious, the ones who couldn't simply live mortal lives and accept mortal limitations, but had to push, had to test, had to see how far they could go before the divine patience snapped. And the answer to that question, demonstrated in every boulder rolled, every fruit branch lifted, every wheel turned, every liver eaten, is not far enough, never far enough, because the god's patience has limits, and those limits, once crossed, reveal consequences that last forever. Looking out across Tartarus, you feel something unexpected, not horror exactly, though there's elements of that, but a kind of awful understanding. These people weren't monsters, not really. They were people who made choices, bad choices, catastrophically bad choices, but choices nonetheless. Sisyphus thought he was clever enough to cheat death, and maybe he was clever, just not clever enough. Tantalus thought he could test the gods and get away with it, and he was wrong. Ixion thought divine grace meant divine approval of whatever he wanted to do, and he paid the price for that assumption. Tityos listened to his baser impulses and attacked someone under divine protection. The Danaids obeyed a father's command even though it meant murder. Each punishment fits not just the crime, but the psychology behind it. Sisyphus, who thought himself the cleverest of men, performs the stupidest labor imaginable. Tantalus, who abused divine hospitality and abundance, exists in a state of deprivation surrounded by plenty. Ixion, who pursued forbidden lust, spins eternally without satisfaction. Tityos, who acted on violent desire, has his seat of desire destroyed and regenerated daily. The Danaids, who acted collectively in murder, suffer collective futility. The gods were nothing if not thorough in their poetic justice. Your guide begins leading you back, retracing your path through Tartarus's twisted geography. The sounds of suffering fade behind you as you approach the boundaries of this place, and you realize something you hadn't quite articulated before. None of the punished even noticed you. They were so consumed by their own suffering, so locked into their eternal cycles, that a living visitor could walk among them completely unremarked. It's a kind of isolation beyond anything possible in mortal life, to be so completely absorbed in your own consequence that the entire rest of reality becomes irrelevant. You pass through the gates once more, Cerberus raising one head in vague interest but not bothering to stand, and you find Charon waiting at the near bank of the Acheron. The return crossing seems quicker somehow, or perhaps you're simply more accustomed to the passage now, and soon you're climbing the paths that lead upward, away from the underworld, back toward the realm of light and life and time that moves forward rather than spinning in place. As you climb, you find yourself thinking about the ones you saw, wondering if any of them, given the chance, would choose differently. Would Sisyphus value being clever over being free? Would Tantalus treasure his son over his test? Would Ixion control his lust if he knew the price? The myths don't answer these questions because the myths aren't interested in redemption. They're interested in consequence, in demonstrating that the universe operates on certain principles, and violating those principles has costs that cannot be negotiated away, cannot be sweet-talked into leniency, cannot be cleverly escaped. The ancient Greeks built their entire religious and moral framework around this understanding that there are rules, both written and unwritten, and that breaking them matters. Not because the gods are loving and want you to be good for your own sake, but because the gods are powerful and demand respect for their sake. It's a transactional relationship, one based on honor and hierarchy and the fundamental understanding that some beings are simply greater than others and that gap must be acknowledged. Modern sensibilities tend to rebel against this framework. We prefer our justice reformative, our punishments temporary, our mistakes forgivable. The idea of eternal consequence for finite crime strikes many as fundamentally unjust. But the Greeks weren't concerned with our comfort or our modern notions of proportionality. They were concerned with maintaining cosmic order, and cosmic order, as they understood it, required that challenges to divine authority be met with overwhelming eternal response. You emerge at last into twilight, that space between the underworld and the mortal world proper, where the air is neither living nor dead, but something in between. Your guide's presence begins to fade, its task complete, and you're left alone to process what you've witnessed. The myths will stay with you, the image of Sisyphus and his boulder, Tantalus and his water, Ixion and his wheel, Tityos and his vultures, the Danaids and their leaking jars. These stories have persisted for more than 2 millennia, passed from generation to generation, not because they're comforting, but because they're profound. They ask fundamental questions about justice, about power, about the relationship between mortal and divine, about what we owe to hospitality and family and cosmic order. They don't provide easy answers. The Greeks were too sophisticated for that. But they provide frameworks for thinking about consequence, about the weight of actions, about what it means to be human in a universe governed by forces vastly more powerful than yourself. And there's something else too, something more personal, a kind of comfort in the knowledge that, at least according to Greek mythology, the truly wicked, the ones who betrayed and murdered and violated sacred laws, actually did face consequences. In a world where justice often seems absent, where the powerful escape punishment and the weak suffer unfairly, the myths of Tartarus offered a guarantee that on a cosmic scale, if not always on a human one, accounts were eventually settled, balances eventually restored. The myths also served as a warning, of course. Don't be clever like Sisyphus. Don't be proud like Tantalus. Don't be lustful like Ixion. Don't act on violent impulse like Tityos. Don't obey immoral commands like the Danaids. Live within your proper sphere, respect the gods, honor hospitality, protect guests, maintain family bonds, and you'll avoid their fates. It's a moral code embedded in cautionary tales, the ancient world's version of behave or else, but with the or else specified in terrible, imaginative detail. As you continue your ascent back toward the world of light and change and death that actually ends, you carry these lessons with you. Not necessarily as religious truths. Most modern listeners don't literally believe in Hades or Tartarus or Zeus, but as psychological and philosophical insights into how humans understand consequence, justice, and the eternal questions of right and wrong. The specific gods may fade, the literal underworld may become metaphor, but the core truth remains. Actions have consequences. Some consequences last far longer than we'd like, and the universe keeps accounts we cannot see, but which will eventually come due. The path ahead grows brighter, and you know you're approaching the boundary, that threshold between the realm of myth and the realm of your ordinary life. Soon you'll wake, or turn off the video or close the book, and Tartarus will recede into the background of your consciousness, becoming once more a story, a myth, a fascinating glimpse into how ancient people understood divine justice. But something of it will remain with you, a certain awareness of weight, of consequence, of the idea that actions ripple forward through time in ways we cannot always predict, but which matter nonetheless. The Greeks understood this deeply, built their culture around it, created stories powerful enough to survive the death of their civilization and speak to generations who worship different gods or no gods at all. And in the quiet moments, when you're faced with a choice between cleverness and wisdom, between pride and humility, between desire and restraint, perhaps you'll remember Sisyphus with his boulder, Tantalus with his water, Ixion with his wheel. Perhaps you'll remember that some mistakes can't be undone, some consequences can't be escaped, and some choices matter more than we realize in the moment we make them. The Greeks gave us these myths as gifts. Terrible gifts in some ways, but gifts nonetheless, windows into human nature and divine nature and the complicated relationship between them. They remind us that we're not the first people to struggle with questions of justice and consequence, that humans have been grappling with these issues for thousands of years, and that the answers, such as they are, lie not in comfortable platitudes, but in clear-eyed acknowledgement of how the world actually works. Tartarus stands eternal in Greek imagination, a place beyond time where consequence becomes concrete, where abstract notions of justice take form in boulder and water and wheel. It's a place you visited tonight in safety as an observer, but which in the logic of myth could have been your destination had you lived in ancient Greece and made the wrong choices. That's the power of these stories. They make the abstract visceral, turn moral philosophy into narrative, transform don't do bad things into or you'll end up like Sisyphus, pushing that boulder forever. As you cross the final threshold and Tartarus fades behind you, take a moment to appreciate the sophistication of these ancient myths, the psychological insight required to create punishments that so perfectly mirror crimes, the cultural understanding needed to identify which transgressions merited eternal consequence versus temporary discomfort. The Greeks were master storytellers, but they were also master psychologists, understanding human nature well enough to create cautionary tales that still resonate millennia after the last true believer in Zeus offered the last sacrifice at his altar. Sleep well tonight, secure in the knowledge that whatever mistakes you've made, whatever poor choices you regret, you almost certainly haven't earned a place in Tartarus. The bar for eternal punishment is, thankfully, quite high, requiring not just error, but extraordinary hubris, not just wrongdoing, but fundamental violation of cosmic order. Most of us live our lives in the vast middle ground between heroism and villainy, and for us, the asphodel meadows wait, neutral and peaceful and mercifully monotonous. But remember the lessons anyway. Remember that actions matter, that consequences ripple, that the universe, whether governed by gods or by more impersonal forces, tends toward balance, toward justice, toward the settling of accounts. The specifics may change across cultures and times, but the core truth persists. What we do matters, how we treat others matters, and somewhere, somehow, it's all being recorded in a ledger we cannot see, but which will eventually reveal what we're truly worth. Now let's turn our attention to the machinery behind these eternal punishments, the divine bureaucracy that ensures every soul receives exactly what it deserves, no more, no less, measured with a precision that would make any modern accountant weep with envy. The Greeks understood something we often forget, that justice on a cosmic scale requires organization, requires systems, requires beings willing to dedicate eternity itself to the careful weighing of mortal actions. And so they placed, at the very threshold between judgment and punishment, three figures whose mortal lives prepared them uniquely for their eternal task. You stand once more before the three judges of the dead, but this time your guide encourages you to observe them more closely, to understand not just what they do, but who they were, and why Zeus himself chose them from among all his countless offspring to sit in judgment over every soul that enters his brother's realm. These are not arbitrary appointments, not divine nepotism run amok, but careful selections of individuals whose mortal experiences taught them precisely what the role required. Each judge brings something unique to the tribunal, each represents a different aspect of justice itself, and together they form a system sophisticated enough to evaluate the infinite variety of human moral experience. Minos sits in the center, and as you look upon him, you begin to see past the demigod judge to the mortal king he once was. Born to Zeus and Europa, Minos ruled Crete in an age when that island stood at the center of the Mediterranean world, a nexus of trade and culture and power. He was not merely a king who happened to be just, he was a lawgiver, a creator of the legal codes that would govern Cretan society for generations. The laws of Minos were famous throughout the ancient world, praised for their clarity, their comprehensiveness, their fundamental fairness. During his mortal life, Minos established a legal system so sophisticated that other city-states sent representatives to Crete to study it, to copy it, to adapt its principles to their own societies. He understood something crucial. That law must be more than arbitrary command. It must reflect some deeper principle of order, some fundamental truth about how civilized beings should interact. His courts were open to all, rich and poor alike, and his judgments were renowned for cutting through surface appearances to find the truth beneath. He created a code that balanced punishment with rehabilitation, that recognized different levels of culpability, that understood context mattered as much as action. But Minos was not perfect. The Greeks were too sophisticated to believe in perfect mortals, and his own story carries the stain of terrible decisions. It was Minos who failed to sacrifice the Cretan bull as he had promised to Poseidon, a failure that would lead to his wife's unnatural passion and the birth of the Minotaur. It was Minos who demanded Athens send 7 youths and 7 maidens every 9 years to feed to that monster, a cruel tribute born of vengeance for his son's death. These were not the actions of an ideal ruler, but perhaps that's precisely why Zeus chose him for this role. Minos knows firsthand how even the just can make unjust choices, how circumstances can complicate morality, how the line between righteousness and revenge can blur. In the underworld, Minos holds the final vote when his brother judges cannot agree on a soul's fate. He is the arbiter of the difficult cases, the ones where good and evil are so intertwined that simple categorization fails. His golden scepter, carried from his mortal kingship into his eternal role, symbolizes both authority and the weight of judgment. When you watch him question a newly arrived soul, you notice how thoroughly he probes, how he seeks not just to catalogue actions, but to understand motivations, how he weighs not merely what was done, but why it was done, under what circumstances, with what understanding. To Minos's right sits Rhadamanthus, and if Minos represents the complexity of justice, Rhadamanthus embodies its absolute clarity. Brother to Minos, also born of Zeus and Europa, Rhadamanthus was known in his mortal life for judgments so transparently fair that even those condemned by them acknowledged their righteousness. Where Minos created comprehensive legal codes, Rhadamanthus operated on simpler, more fundamental principles. His most famous law, recorded by ancient writers, held that anyone who defended themselves against an aggressor who initiated violence should face no penalty, a recognition that justice must account for self-preservation and the difference between aggression and defense. Rhadamanthus ruled the islands of the Aegean with such wisdom that Zeus himself sometimes consulted him in matters of dispute among mortals. His reputation for integrity was absolute. His name became synonymous with impartial judgment. The Greeks told stories of how Rhadamanthus could discern truth from lies with a single glance, how no amount of eloquent pleading could sway him from what was right, how he judged both king and peasant by identical standards. In an age when justice often bent toward those with power or wealth, Rhadamanthus stood as a remarkable exception, proof that at least sometimes, somewhere, fairness could prevail. In the underworld, Rhadamanthus judges souls from Asia, a vast territory encompassing everyone from the eastern edges of the Greek world. But he holds another role, perhaps even more significant. He is Lord of Elysium, the blessed fields where heroes and the virtuous spend eternity in peace and pleasure. This dual role makes perfect sense when you consider it. The judge who most purely embodied fairness in life now presides over the realm of reward, ensuring that those who earn paradise actually deserve it, that Elysium remains untainted by anyone who merely seemed good rather than being good. You observe Rhadamanthus as he examines a soul, and where Minos asks probing questions, Rhadamanthus seems to simply see. His judgment comes swiftly, decisively, without hesitation or doubt. There's something almost mathematical about his process, as if he's calculating moral equations and arriving at inevitable conclusions. He is justice as pure function, uncomplicated by mercy or vengeance, simply determining what is and directing souls accordingly. To Minos's left sits Iacchus, the third judge, and his role completes the tribunal's balance. Son of Zeus and the nymph Aegina, Iacchus's mortal story is perhaps the strangest of the three. Zeus fell in love with Aegina and spirited her away to a deserted island, abandoning her there alone. When Iacchus was born, he grew up as the sole inhabitant of this island, a prince without subjects, a king without a kingdom. Recognizing his son's loneliness, Zeus transformed the island's ants into people, the myrmidons, giving Iacchus a population to rule and a chance to demonstrate his fitness for leadership. As king of this ant-born people, Iacchus became renowned for his piety, for his absolute devotion to proper religious observance, and his unwavering respect for divine authority. Where Minos was known for legal wisdom and Rhadamanthus for impartial judgment, Iacchus was celebrated for his relationship with the gods themselves. When drought struck Greece and the oracles proclaimed that only Iacchus's prayers could end it, he interceded with Zeus and rain returned. His righteousness was so complete that the gods trusted him in ways they trusted few mortals, and that trust followed him into death. In the underworld, Aeacus judges souls from Europe, but he holds another crucial position. He is the doorkeeper of Hades, the keeper of the keys to the underworld itself. This role speaks to the trust placed in him. He literally controls access to this realm, and his piety ensures that the boundaries between life and death, between mortal world and underworld, remain properly maintained. Where Minos understands the complexity of mortal choices and Rhadamanthus embodies pure fairness, Iacchus represents the importance of respecting divine order, of understanding one's place in the cosmic hierarchy. You watch the three judges work in concert, and a pattern emerges. Souls arrive, brought by Hermes or having made their own way across the Acheron. Iacchus reviews their lives first, checking for crimes against the gods, for impiety, for violations of sacred law. Those who pass his examination move to either Rhadamanthus or Minos, depending on their origin. Rhadamanthus handles straightforward cases where virtue and vice are clearly delineated, while Minos takes the complicated ones where context and circumstance muddy the moral waters. When disagreement arises, when a soul's fate hangs in balance, Minos casts the deciding vote. It's a system, you realize, that accounts for the full spectrum of human moral experience. Aeacus ensures that relationship with the divine is properly weighed. Rhadamanthus provides swift, clear justice for the obviously righteous and the obviously wicked, and Minos handles the vast middle ground where most humans actually exist. Together they form a tribunal that is simultaneously compassionate and stern, understanding and absolute, complex and clear. It's divine bureaucracy at its finest, a recognition that eternal judgment requires eternal patience, eternal wisdom, and yes, eternal paperwork. Which role in the underworld would you find most fascinating to observe? For me, it has to be Iacchus as doorkeeper, because there's something compelling about the guardian roles, the ones who maintain boundaries and ensure systems function properly, even if they don't get the spotlight that judges or punishers receive. The judges represent something profoundly Greek in their very existence, the idea that true justice requires mortal experience, that even gods and demigods cannot judge human life without having lived it themselves. Zeus could have appointed any beings to these roles, could have chosen abstract embodiments of justice or law, but instead he selected men who had ruled, who had made difficult decisions, who had struggled with moral complexity and emerged worthy of immortal trust. The very fact of their mortality, now transcended, makes them fit to judge other mortals. This principle, that justice requires experience, permeates Greek thought about law and governance. The Greeks didn't believe in impartial arbiters descending from on high with perfect wisdom. They believed in human beings learning through trial and error, through success and failure, gradually accumulating the wisdom necessary to judge fairly. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus each spent mortal lifetimes making judgments, seeing their consequences, adjusting their understanding, and earning reputations for fairness that transcended their own cities and eras. But there's also a warning embedded in their stories, particularly in Minos's tale. Even the most just judge is still human, still capable of terrible errors, still vulnerable to passions that override wisdom. The same Minos who created legal codes admired throughout the Mediterranean also condemned innocent Athenian youth to die for his own revenge. The Greeks held these contradictions in tension, unwilling to pretend that justice could ever be perfectly administered, while still insisting it must be pursued. You linger before the judges, watching soul after soul appear for judgment, and you notice something else. The vast majority are sent to the asphodel meadows, that grey realm of forgetting where neither punishment nor reward awaits. These are the ordinary dead, people who lived unremarkable lives, who committed no great crimes but achieved no great virtue either. They worked, they loved, they raised families, they died, and now they fade into a peaceful monotony that might be preferable to the alternative for those who lack heroic aspirations. A smaller number are directed toward Elysium, and these souls seem to glow somehow, as if virtue leaves a visible mark. They are the warriors who died honorably, the rulers who governed justly, the poets who elevated human consciousness, the mothers who raised exceptional children, the friends who demonstrated uncommon loyalty. Their virtue isn't always dramatic or public. Sometimes it's quiet, persistent goodness accumulated over decades of small choices. But the judges recognize it, and Rhadamanthus smiles, a rare expression, as he directs them toward the blessed fields. And then, occasionally, rarely, a soul arrives, and all three judges lean forward with expressions of interest and revulsion. These are Tartarus's candidates, the ones who committed crimes so severe that eternal punishment becomes necessary. You watch as they're questioned, as their lives are examined in excruciating detail, as every choice that led to their damnation is weighed and measured. The judges show no mercy, but neither do they show vindictiveness. They're simply determining facts, calculating consequences, arriving at verdicts with the same dispassion they'd use to solve mathematical equations. When the Furies arrive to collect one of these condemned souls, even the judges show faint unease. These ancient spirits of vengeance are older than the Olympian gods, older perhaps than the judges themselves, and they serve a purpose that transcends even the careful deliberations of the tribunal. They are the enforcers, the ones who ensure punishment, once decreed, is absolutely carried out. But we'll return to them later. For now, we must shift our attention to the landscape itself, to the emotional geography through which all souls must pass. The underworld is defined not merely by its regions, Tartarus, Asphodel, Elysium, but by its rivers, 5 great waterways that flow through the realm of death, each one carrying its own burden of meaning, each one representing a particular emotional or spiritual state. These rivers aren't simply geographic features, they're psychological boundaries, philosophical concepts made liquid, flowing embodiments of what death means and what it costs. You've already crossed the Acheron, the river of woe, but let's consider it more deeply now. The Acheron flows dark and wide, its waters carrying all the sorrow of mortal existence, every tear shed in grief, every moan of pain, every sigh of loss. Ancient sources disagree on whether Acheron is the river Charon crosses or merely feeds the Styx, but all agree on its essential nature. It is the river of pain and suffering, the first barrier between life and death. When souls arrive at the Acheron's banks, they're still carrying the full weight of their mortal memories, their loves and hates, their regrets and satisfactions, their fear of what comes next. The river represents the necessity of acknowledging this pain, of feeling fully the cost of mortality before moving forward into whatever awaits. You cannot skip across Acheron, cannot bypass its waters. You must either cross via Charon's ferry or, if you cannot pay, wait beside it for 100 years, watching others make the journey you cannot yet complete. The Greeks placed coins in corpses' mouths or over their eyes, specifically to pay Charon's fee, ensuring their loved ones wouldn't be trapped beside the Acheron. This practice reveals something touching about their beliefs. Even death's inevitability didn't erase human responsibility for one another. The living owed the dead at least this much: passage across the river of woe, admission into the underworld proper rather than an eternity of liminal waiting. But Acheron, for all its sorrowful reputation, is merely the entrance. Once across, souls encounter the Styx, and here the emotional landscape shifts from personal grief to cosmic significance. The Styx is the river of hatred, yes, but more precisely, it's the river of oaths, the most sacred barrier in all Greek mythology. When gods swear by the Styx, they bind themselves absolutely, for to break such an oath means severe punishment. Even immortals face consequences for violating this river's sanctity. The Styx flows around the underworld 7 or 9 times, depending on which ancient source you trust, creating concentric circles of separation between life and death. Its waters are deadly even to immortals, capable of dissolving almost anything they touch, corroding even the vessels of the gods. Yet these same waters, paradoxically, can grant invulnerability, as Thetis discovered when she dipped her infant son Achilles into the Styx, holding him by the heel, making his body impervious to weapons except for that one vulnerable spot. This dual nature, simultaneously deadly and protective, reflects the river's deeper meaning. The Styx represents the absolute boundary between states of being, the line that cannot be crossed casually or violated without consequence. To swear by the Styx is to stake everything on your word, to make your oath as uncrossable as the river itself. The gods fear breaking such oaths not from moral compunction but from certain punishment, for when Zeus caught a god lying after swearing by the Styx, that deity would lose consciousness for a full year, then be barred from divine councils for 9 more years, essentially dying and being exiled in the only way immortals can experience such states. The goddess Styx herself embodies this principle. Daughter of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, she sided with Zeus during his war against the Titans, and in gratitude Zeus gave her river this special status. Her name means hateful or shuddering, but this reflects not evil but the terrible necessity of absolute boundaries, of lines that must not be crossed regardless of desire or desperation. As you walk along the Styx's banks, guided safely by your mysterious companion, you feel its power as a pressure in the air, a sense that this water is not truly water, but something else, a liquid form of divine will perhaps, or the very concept of boundary, given physical presence. Souls who cross it leave behind any possibility of return, any hope of second chances in the mortal world. This is commitment absolute, the final severance of life's thread, acknowledgement that death is not a state you visit, but a realm you enter and remain in forever. The third river winds through quieter regions of the underworld, and its name speaks to a different aspect of death's transformation. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flows past the cave of Hypnos, the god of sleep, its waters offering release from memory's burden. Those souls, destined for the asphodel meadows, drink from Lethe, and in drinking forget their mortal lives, their loves and hates, their triumphs and failures, their very identities gradually fading until nothing remains but a peaceful, mindless existence. At first consideration, forgetting seems like punishment, like losing yourself is a tragedy to be avoided. But the Greeks understood it could also be mercy, that some memories burn so terribly that oblivion becomes a gift. The mother who lost all her children, the warrior who committed atrocities in battle, the spouse who betrayed their beloved, these souls might welcome Lethe's waters, might gratefully surrender painful memories in exchange for peace. Lethe becomes especially significant when considering reincarnation, a belief that grew more prominent in later Greek philosophy. Souls preparing to return to mortal life would drink from Lethe to forget their previous existence, ensuring they entered their new life without the baggage of the old. This makes a kind of psychological sense. How could you fully live a new life while remembering your previous one? How could you bond with new parents while remembering different parents, love a new spouse while remembering a previous marriage? Forgetting becomes necessary for renewal, for the chance to start fresh without the accumulated weight of previous existences. Yet there's tragedy in Lethe too, for it erases not just pain but joy, not just failure but achievement. The philosopher who finally understood some crucial truth, the artist who created beauty, the lover who experienced transcendent connection, all of it washed away in Lethe's waters, leaving nothing behind. The river represents death's ultimate democracy. Eventually all mortals, regardless of accomplishment or virtue, fade into forgetting, unless they achieve the immortality of legend, of being remembered by the living, whose memories even Lethe cannot touch. You watch souls approach Lethe's banks, and their reactions vary. Some drink eagerly, desperate to forget, while others hesitate, clutching at fading memories like drowning swimmers grasping at wreckage. But, eventually, inevitably, they all drink, and you see awareness fade from their eyes, replaced by a dreamy vacancy that suggests neither happiness nor sorrow, simply absence. It's peaceful, you suppose, in its way, though it carries the peace of non-existence rather than contentment. The fourth river burns rather than flows, and its very existence seems to violate natural law. Phlegethon, the river of fire, cascades through Tartarus in torrents of flame, providing the only real light in that dark realm, though its illumination comes with searing heat and the screams of those punished within its waters. This is not symbolic fire, but real flame that burns without consuming, that causes eternal agony without offering the release of destruction. Phlegethon represents purification through suffering, the idea that certain crimes require cleansing by fire before the soul can be released. But in Tartarus, where punishment is eternal, Phlegethon's fire purifies nothing, it simply burns, demonstrating divine wrath in its most elemental form. Some of the damned find themselves partially submerged in Phlegethon as part of their punishment, the flames licking at their flesh in carefully calibrated increments, never quite consuming them, never quite allowing them to grow accustomed to the pain. The Greeks associated fire with transformation, with the destruction of old forms and the creation of new ones, but Phlegethon perverts this natural process. Its fires transform nothing, they simply burn endlessly, a reminder that in Tartarus, change is impossible, growth is forbidden, and suffering is the only constant. The river flows in a circuit through the punishment realm, its flames reflected in pools of shadow, creating a landscape of hellish beauty that would be almost magnificent if not for the agony it represents. Standing near Phlegethon's banks, you feel its heat even through your protection, and you understand viscerally why fire features so prominently in humanity's conceptions of hell. There's something uniquely terrible about burning, the way it attacks every nerve, the way it combines pain with destruction, the way it suggests consumption without offering the mercy of ending. Phlegethon takes this fear and makes it eternal, demonstrating that divine creativity and punishment isn't always a blessing. The fifth river completes the circuit, and its name alone evokes the despair of the damned. Cocytus, the river of wailing, flows with tears shed by the suffering, its waters composed of lamentation itself, liquid grief condensed from the sorrow of the punished. Where the Acheron carries the woe of those entering death, Cocytus collects the ongoing anguish of those trapped in eternal punishment, growing fuller with each passing moment as new tears add to its volume. Ancient sources describe Cocytus as a branch of the Styx, which makes symbolic sense. The river of oaths and boundaries feeds the river of consequences, the tears of those who broke cosmic law flowing inevitably from the boundary they violated. Cocytus winds through Tartarus, and its sound is said to be unbearable, a chorus of every regret, every plea for mercy that will never be granted, every expression of suffering without hope of relief. The river's emotional weight is almost physical. You feel it pressing on you as you approach its banks, a crushing awareness of accumulated sorrow that makes your own troubles seem laughably small. This is suffering distilled and concentrated, thousands upon thousands of years of punishment generating an ocean of tears, and Cocytus carries them all, a liquid record of divine justice's terrible necessity. What's striking about the five rivers, when considered together, is how completely they map the emotional landscape of death. Woe, oaths, forgetfulness, purification, and lamentation, these aren't random attributes but a sophisticated understanding of what dying and being dead actually mean, psychologically and spiritually. Every soul must cross woe to enter death, must acknowledge the boundaries represented by oaths and hatred, must eventually choose or be forced to forget, must face either purifying fire or purified paradise, and if punished, must contribute their wailing to the river that records all suffering. The rivers also flow into each other at the heart of Tartarus, according to some sources, creating a central point where all five waters mingle, where every aspect of death converges in a dark pool that reflects nothing and absorbs everything. This convergence represents the totality of death, the point past which mortal categories cease to matter, where all the river's individual characteristics blend into something beyond human categorization. Honestly, which of the five rivers do you find most philosophically interesting? For me, it's Lethe, because there's something profound about forgetfulness as both punishment and mercy, the idea that identity itself might be something we'd choose to surrender under the right circumstances. The rivers teach another lesson too, one the Greeks understood deeply. Geography and emotion are inseparable in the land of the dead. Where you are determines how you feel, and how you feel shapes where you can go. This isn't metaphor but literal truth in Greek conception. The landscape of the underworld is psychological space, made physical, internal states, externalized into rivers and regions you can actually traverse. This understanding influenced how Greeks thought about life as well as death. If the underworld's geography reflected emotional and moral states, then perhaps mortal life worked the same way. Perhaps the landscapes we inhabit and create are expressions of our internal conditions. A kingdom ruled justly becomes paradise on earth, while one ruled through tyranny becomes hellish regardless of its physical beauty. The rivers remind us that we swim in emotional waters even while alive, that sorrow and oaths and forgetfulness and purification and lamentation flow through our mortal world too, invisible but no less real than their underworld counterparts. Your guide leads you away from the rivers now, toward a conceptual space rather than a physical location, and you sense we're about to examine not what punishments are, but why they take the forms they do. This requires understanding hubris, the central crime of almost everyone suffering in Tartarus, the transgression that Greeks considered more fundamental than murder itself. Hubris, in modern usage, has become diluted to mean simple arrogance or excessive pride, but to the ancient Greeks it carried far more specific and terrible meaning. Hubris was the act of a mortal believing they were equal to or could outsmart the gods, the fundamental violation of cosmic hierarchy, the refusal to accept one's proper place in the divine order. It wasn't merely thinking too highly of yourself, it was acting on that inflated self-conception in ways that challenged divine authority or violated natural law. Consider Sisyphus again, his crimes catalogued. He murdered guests, violated hospitality, seduced his niece, but these weren't what earned him Tartarus. Countless mortals committed similar atrocities and ended up in the asphodel meadows after brief earthly punishment. No, Sisyphus's true crime was hubris in its purest form. He thought he was cleverer than death itself, clever enough to trap Thanatos in chains and thereby halt the natural order. When that failed, he thought he was clever enough to trick Persephone into releasing him, to cheat death a second time, to prove that mortal intelligence could overcome divine will. This is hubris. The belief that human cleverness can override cosmic law, that you can hack the system, find loopholes in mortality, outsmart beings who've existed since before time began. Sisyphus wasn't punished for being clever. The Greeks admired intelligence. He was punished for thinking his cleverness made him godlike, for acting as if mortality were a puzzle to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. Or consider Tantalus, who committed acts that make Sisyphus's crimes seem almost quaint. He murdered his own son and served the child's flesh to the gods, the ultimate test of whether they truly knew everything or could be deceived like mortals. This wasn't mere murder, horrific as that is, it was hubris of cosmic scale. Tantalus was saying, in effect, "You gods claim omniscience, but I'd bet I can fool you. I'm clever enough to make you cannibals, to prove that divine knowledge has limits, that I can operate on your level." The gods knew instantly, of course, all except grief-distracted Demeter, and they reconstituted Pelops with an ivory shoulder to replace what she'd consumed. But the attempt itself, the sheer audacity of thinking he could deceive Olympian gods, that's what earned Tantalus his eternal punishment. He rejected the fundamental order of the cosmos, which places gods above mortals in knowledge, power, and authority, and that rejection could not be tolerated. Ixion's hubris manifested differently but no less profoundly. Zeus showed him extraordinary mercy, purifying him of murder and inviting him to dine on Olympus, extending to a mortal the kind of divine grace that should have inspired eternal gratitude. Ixion responded by attempting to seduce Hera, the queen of the gods, Zeus's wife. The Greeks would tell you this wasn't simply lust, though lust was certainly involved. It was Ixion, believing that divine hospitality meant divine equality, that being invited to Olympus made him one of the gods, eligible to pursue divine women regardless of their marital status or interest. This presumption, this equation of himself with Olympians simply because he shared their table, is classic hubris. Ixion forgot or rejected the hierarchy. He confused temporary proximity to power with actual power, and he paid for that confusion with a wheel that spins eternally through flames. The punishment reminds him forever that mortals and gods occupy different spheres, that certain boundaries exist regardless of how close you might temporarily approach the divine. The Danaids' hubris is more subtle but no less real. They obeyed their father's command to murder their husbands, and filial obedience was sacred in Greek culture. But they also elevated themselves above their husbands. They claimed the right to destroy men who had done them no wrong, acting as if their judgment of life and death carried weight equal to divine judgment. 49 women decided collectively that they knew better than fate, that their father's paranoia justified overriding the sacred bonds of marriage, that they could murder with impunity. Their punishment, filling leaking jars eternally, reflects this presumption. They thought themselves capable of holding and controlling life, symbolized by water, but they cannot. The jars leak, the water flows away, and they're left with nothing but the eternal repetition of their failure. They tried to play roles reserved for gods or fate, to control who lives and dies, and their punishment demonstrates that mortals cannot hold or control anything, that all our attempts to grasp and possess ultimately fail, that only the gods can truly contain and direct the waters of life. What ties all these cases together is the refusal to accept mortal limitations, the belief that human will, intelligence, or authority can override divine order. The Greeks had a very specific cosmology. Everything had its place, its proper sphere of operation, its defined limits. Gods operated at one level, mortals at another, and the hierarchy between them was fundamental to reality's structure. Hubris wasn't simply being proud, it was attempting to cross categorical boundaries that existed for cosmic reasons, trying to be something you fundamentally were not. This is why hubris was considered worse than murder. Murder violated human law and caused human suffering. Terrible, certainly, but hubris violated cosmic law and threatened the entire order of existence. A murderer killed individuals, but a hubristic mortal who succeeded in their presumption would unravel reality itself, would prove that hierarchies were meaningless, that limits could be transgressed without consequence, that the structure of the cosmos was negotiable rather than fixed. The gods couldn't allow this, not from compassion or morality, but from necessity. Cosmic order must be maintained or everything collapses. The concept of hubris also reveals something uncomfortable about Greek divine justice. It's not primarily concerned with mortal welfare or mortal flourishing. The gods punish hubris not to help humans avoid mistakes, but to preserve their own authority, to demonstrate that challenges to divine supremacy will not be tolerated. Sisyphus, Tantalus, Ixion, the Danaids, their object lessons, their eternal suffering. A warning that the cosmic hierarchy is non-negotiable, that mortals must accept their place or face consequences that last forever. There's a certain grim honesty in this that modern sensibilities often find disturbing. The Greeks didn't pretend their gods were all loving or primarily concerned with human happiness. Divine justice existed to maintain divine order, and if that occasionally aligned with human notions of fairness, well, that was pleasant but coincidental. The gods were powerful, not good, at least not good in ways mortals would recognize, and their justice reflected power's logic rather than mercies or compassions. Yet hubris teaches positive lessons too, about the importance of understanding limitations, about the value of humility, not as self-deprecation, but as accurate self-assessment. The Greeks celebrated excellence, encouraged striving for greatness, praised those who pushed boundaries and achieved remarkable things, but they insisted on one crucial caveat. Remember you're mortal. Remember your achievements don't make you divine. Remember there are limits you cannot cross regardless of your cleverness or strength or virtue. This is why the Delphic maxim, know thyself, carried such weight. It wasn't an invitation to navel-gazing introspection, but a command to understand accurately what you are and therefore what limits constrain you. Self-knowledge, in Greek thinking, means recognizing you're mortal and all that mortality entails, recognizing your proper sphere and staying within it, recognizing that some things are reserved for gods and attempting them brings only ruin. The alternative to hubris, then, isn't mediocrity or passivity, but rather excellence, exercised within appropriate bounds. You can be the cleverest mortal who ever lived like Odysseus, but you cannot be cleverer than death. You can be the strongest warrior like Achilles, but you cannot defeat fate. You can create laws like Minos or judge fairly like Rhadamanthus, but you cannot escape dying and being judged yourself. The recognition of these limits doesn't diminish achievement, it properly contextualizes it, allowing mortals to excel without the fatal presumption that excellence makes them divine. Looking across Tartarus, seeing Sisyphus push his boulder and Tantalus reach for fruit, you understand that hubris isn't just a crime, but a category error, a fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of being you are. These punishments last forever because the error they address is categorical. You cannot stop being mortal any more than gods can start being mortal, and attempting to cross that boundary doesn't just break a rule, it attacks the structure of reality itself. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Tartarus's punishments, that terrible precision, the way each one mirrors the crime with an artistry that speaks to divine creativity at its most cruel. The Greeks called this poetic justice, though they didn't use that exact phrase, the principle that punishment should reflect crime, that suffering should somehow rhyme with transgression. This principle has a formal name, lex talionis, an eye for an eye, but the divine punishments exceed simple equivalence, they transform the crime into eternal metaphor. Sisyphus thought himself clever enough to control death, to make the impossible possible through intelligence and trickery. His punishment gives him a task that appears achievable, a boulder and a hill, push one up the other, surely mortal strength and persistence can accomplish this. But the gods enchanted the boulder to always roll back just before the summit, turning Sisyphus's cleverness against him. He must use his intelligence to calculate the best angle of push, the optimal path, the perfect timing, and all that intelligence, all that problem-solving skill he was so proud of, accomplishes absolutely nothing. He's condemned to eternal futility, forced to apply his greatest strength to a task designed to defeat it, demonstrating that mortal cleverness, however impressive, cannot overcome divine will when divine will is set against it. The punishment is perfect. It doesn't simply hurt Sisyphus, it forces him to relive his crime eternally. Every time he positions himself beneath the boulder, he's choosing again to think he can accomplish the impossible. Every push up the slope is another expression of that hubristic confidence, and every roll back down is reality reasserting itself, proving again that his assessment of his own capabilities was fatally flawed. He learns nothing. He cannot learn. The enchantment prevents that, so he's trapped in eternal recurrence of the same psychological pattern that led to his damnation. Tantalus's punishment displays even more sophisticated artistry in its mirroring. He abused divine hospitality by stealing ambrosia and nectar, by revealing divine secrets, and ultimately by serving his own son as food to test the gods. His crime centered on consumption, on treating the sacred meal shared with gods as something he could manipulate and control. So his punishment involves eternal hunger and thirst, the basest forms of need, rendering him forever desperate for the very thing he once abused. But the cruelty goes deeper. He stands in water beneath fruit trees, surrounded by abundance, yet unable to consume any of it. This mirrors his crime precisely. He was surrounded by divine abundance on Olympus, invited to share in pleasures reserved for immortals, yet he couldn't simply accept and enjoy them. He had to test them, manipulate them, use them for his own purposes. Now he's surrounded by simple mortal food and drink, offered the basic sustenance any peasant enjoys, yet he cannot partake. The reversal is complete. From elevated guest unable to appreciate abundance to degraded supplicant unable to access basics, and both states stem from the same flaw, his inability to accept what's offered without trying to control or transform it. The word tantalize entered our language from his punishment, and that's fitting because tantalization is precisely what he experiences, the torment of seeing clearly what would relieve suffering while being unable to reach it. He tantalized the gods by offering them forbidden food. Now he's tantalized by food he cannot eat, the punishment fitting the crime so perfectly it becomes almost aesthetic, a work of dark art showcasing divine understanding of psychological torture. Ixion's wheel demonstrates the same terrible precision. He pursued forbidden lust, trying to possess what was not his to claim, trying to cross boundaries that existed for cosmic reasons. His punishment binds him to a wheel that spins eternally, never allowing him to possess anything, to claim anything, to even remain in one position long enough to grow accustomed to it. He's in perpetual motion, perpetual instability, the opposite of possession or control. And the wheel is fiery, burning him with passion's heat, but transformed from pleasure to agony, reminding him forever that desire unconstrained by propriety and respect leads not to satisfaction, but to suffering. The spinning also disorients completely. Ixion cannot focus on anything, cannot develop relationships or understanding, cannot achieve the kind of stable presence that would allow for genuine connection. He wanted to connect with Hera inappropriately, to force intimacy where none was invited, and his punishment ensures he can never connect with anything, forever spinning through space, forever alone, forever unable to grasp even the basic stability required for any kind of relationship. Tityos's punishment might seem similar to Prometheus's. Both have their livers eaten by birds, both suffer regenerating organs, but the differences matter. Prometheus is a titan, a divine being punished for helping humanity. His liver being eaten represents his immortal nature being used against him, his capacity for renewal ensuring his suffering never ends. Tityos is mortal, or was, and his crime was attempted rape of a goddess. The liver was considered the seat of desire and passion in Greek thought, so having his liver eternally devoured is having his capacity for desire itself destroyed and restored in endless cycle. His punishment says, "You acted on violent lust, so you will experience violent destruction of lust's organ forever." But it goes further. He stretched across 9 acres, his body pulled to massive proportions, making him absurdly vulnerable, unable to protect himself, completely exposed. He tried to overpower Leto through his size and strength, to use physical superiority to force himself on her, and now his size and strength become tools of his torture, creating more surface area for suffering, more flesh for the vultures to tear. The Danaids with their leaking jars represent collective punishment for collective crime, and the symbolism is rich. They tried to control life and death, murdering their husbands to preserve their own status and obey their father. Water symbolizes life throughout Greek culture, and jars were how households stored and controlled water, ensuring survival. The Danaids are given an eternal task that appears meaningful, filling a large vessel with water, collective labor toward a shared goal, but the means of accomplishing it are fundamentally broken. Their individual jars leak, ensuring that no matter how hard they work, how carefully they carry, how quickly they pour, they can never fill the pythos. The punishment addresses both their crime and their flaw. They thought they could control life, water, but they cannot. It flows away despite their efforts. They acted collectively in murder, 49 sisters unified in their crime, and now they labor collectively in futility, their shared effort accomplishing nothing. The task seems possible. Unlike Sisyphus's boulder, it doesn't actively roll backward, yet it's equally futile, demonstrating that some failures stem not from impossible obstacles, but from fundamental flaws in method, in approach, in tools, in understanding. There's almost an intellectual beauty to these punishments when considered as artistic expressions, each one a carefully crafted statement about crime and consequence, about how transgression contains its own punishment if only you understand it deeply enough. The gods here demonstrate mastery of metaphor, of turning crimes into eternal experiences that perfectly reflect their essential nature, creating punishments that are simultaneously physically painful and psychologically torturous. The principle at work, lex talionis taken to its logical extreme, is that punishment should mirror crime. But these divine punishments exceed mere mirroring. They're more like twisted reflections, funhouse distortions that preserve the crime's essential shape while transforming it into something monstrous. Sisyphus wanted to control the impossible. He gets an impossible task. Tantalus abused abundance. He drowns in inaccessible abundance. Ixion pursued inappropriate connection. He spins forever unable to connect with anything. Tityos exercised violent desire. His desire is violently destroyed and restored eternally. The Danaids tried to contain life. They try eternally to contain water. This sophisticated understanding of poetic justice reveals Greek philosophical depth. They recognized that crimes aren't just actions, but expressions of flawed character, of misunderstanding about how reality works. The appropriate punishment, therefore, isn't merely pain to match the pain caused, though that's part of it, but an eternal experience that forces the criminal to confront their specific delusion forever. Sisyphus must eternally confront that mortal cleverness has limits. Tantalus that you cannot control divine generosity, Ixion that desire must respect boundaries, Tityos that violence begets violence, and the Danaids that murder doesn't preserve life. Yet there's something troubling here too. The punishments don't reform anyone. They can't, because the enchantments prevent learning or change. Sisyphus will push his boulder forever without ever accepting that it's futile. Tantalus will reach for fruit eternally without ever recognizing the pattern. They're locked into their crime's psychology for all eternity, unable to grow or change or repent. This reveals a harsh truth about Greek divine justice. It's not interested in rehabilitation or redemption, only in demonstration and deterrence, only in showing the living what happens when you cross certain lines. The perfection of these punishments also demonstrates a disturbing amount of attention paid to torture, a creative energy devoted to crafting suffering that will last forever. The gods here appear as artists of agony, and while we can appreciate the intellectual elegance of their work, we might also recoil from what it reveals about divine nature, that beings of immense power find it appropriate to devote that power to creating perfect, eternal suffering for those who offended them. This tension between admiring the artistry and recoiling from the cruelty is perhaps intentional, part of what the myths teach. The gods are powerful, not good, at least not good in ways mortals should emulate, and their justice is terrible precisely because it's so perfectly executed. A sloppy, arbitrary punishment might be easier to dismiss as mere vengeance, but these carefully crafted, symbolically rich punishments force us to acknowledge that divine justice, even when we find it excessive, operates on principles, has internal logic, deserves to be called justice even if we wish it were tempered with more mercy. Which punishment do you find most perfectly mirrors its crime? For me, it's Tantalus, because there's something almost Shakespearean in the reversal of his fortune, the way he goes from honoured guest unable to appreciate abundance, to desperate beggar unable to access basics, all because he couldn't simply accept what was offered without trying to control or test it. The punishments also teach through deterrence. Every Greek who heard these myths would think twice before attempting similar crimes, not from moral conviction necessarily, but from fear of consequences. This is justice as education through terror, using extreme examples to establish boundaries everyone can understand. You might not fully grasp why hubris is so terrible, might not appreciate the philosophical implications of challenging cosmic hierarchy, but you can understand that you don't want to end up like Sisyphus or Tantalus or Ixion, and so you'll avoid their mistakes whether or not you comprehend their full significance. There's pragmatic wisdom in this approach. Comprehensive moral education might be ideal, but failing that, simple fear of consequences works reasonably well for maintaining social order. The myths of Tartarus served this purpose in Greek society. They made cosmic law visceral and immediate, transforming abstract principles about respecting gods and accepting limitations into concrete images of suffering that children and adults alike could understand and fear. Yet the myths also invite deeper reflection for those capable of it. They ask us to consider what justice actually means, whether eternal punishment can ever be proportional to finite crime, whether divine power obligates divine mercy, whether maintaining cosmic order justifies infinite suffering. The Greeks didn't provide easy answers. They held tensions without resolving them, acknowledging that divine justice seemed excessive while also insisting it was necessary, finding the punishments terrible while also recognizing their logical precision. Our final consideration tonight, before we begin ascending back toward the mortal world, must be the enforcers, the ancient spirits who ensure Tartarus's punishments are carried out with absolute fidelity. You've seen them already, lurking at the edges of your vision, but now we approach them directly, ready to understand the Erinyes, the Furies, goddesses of vengeance older than Zeus himself. The Erinyes were born from violence, from the most primal act of family betrayal in all Greek mythology. when Cronus castrated his father Uranus, cutting away the sky god's genitals with a sickle given to him by his mother Gaia, the blood that fell to earth birthed three categories of beings: the giants, the Meliae tree nymphs, and the Erinyes. They sprang fully formed from bloodshed in patricide, in the ultimate violation of family bonds, and that origin defines everything they are and do. Their appearance terrifies even the bravest souls, winged like enormous bats, their faces shifting between beautiful and monstrous depending on the viewer's perspective, their eyes burning with accumulated rage from thousands of years of unpunished crimes finally brought to justice. Snakes writhe in their hair and coil around their arms, living expressions of venomous wrath, and their robes are the colour of dried blood, a reminder that they were born from violence and exist to punish violence, particularly violence against family. The number of Erinyes varies in sources. Sometimes they appear as an innumerable host, other times as three specific individuals: Alecto the Unceasing, Megaera the Jealous, and Tisiphone the Avenger of Murder. These three represent different aspects of the vengeance they embody: Alecto, who never rests, never stops pursuing the guilty no matter how far they flee; Megaera, who ensures that envy and jealousy receive their due punishment, that crimes born of resentment are repaid in kind; and Tisiphone, who specializes in avenging murders, particularly those within families. The Erinyes are older than the Olympian gods, born from titans and primordial forces, and this antiquity matters immensely. They represent justice from before Zeus's rule, from before the sophisticated legal systems and measured judgments of the Olympians. They're primal, operating on older principles, enforcing older laws, answering to imperatives that predate civilization itself. When mortals commit certain crimes, particularly patricide or matricide, the Erinyes don't need Zeus's permission or Hades's command. They simply act, driven by their fundamental nature, to pursue and punish. Their primary concern is blood guilt, especially that arising from family murder, and they pursue such criminals with absolute relentlessness. The famous case of Orestes illustrates their method and their terror. Orestes killed his mother Clytemnestra to avenge his father Agamemnon, whom she had murdered, setting up a terrible conflict where any action violates sacred law. He had to avenge his father, duty demanded it, but in doing so he committed matricide, one of the worst crimes imaginable. The Erinyes descended upon him instantly, driving him mad, tormenting him without cease, giving him no peace day or night. Only after extensive purification rituals and ultimately intervention by both Apollo and Athena, who convinced the Erinyes to accept a trial rather than automatic vengeance, was Orestes freed. And even then, the Erinyes only relented because the trial acquitted him, acknowledging that sometimes competing sacred duties create impossible situations where any choice brings guilt. This rare mercy doesn't represent weakness, but sophistication, the Erinyes learning to work within newer systems of justice while maintaining their ancient role. But in Tartarus, where those confined have received judgment and been condemned, the Erinyes show no such flexibility. Here they're simply enforcers, ensuring punishments proceed exactly as decreed, ensuring no one escapes, no one finds loopholes, no one receives mercy unless the judges themselves grant it. You watch them patrol the spaces between punishments, their wings creating winds that carry the sounds of suffering throughout the realm, their eyes missing nothing, their vigilance absolute. The Erinyes represent justice's oldest form, vengeance-based rather than rehabilitation-based, focused entirely on ensuring that crimes receive proportional punishment regardless of circumstances or regret. Before courts and judges and sophisticated legal reasoning, before the concept that punishment might reform criminals, there were the Erinyes, and beings like them, raw retribution incarnate, ensuring that harming others, especially family, brought terrible consequences. They're not evil, this is crucial to understand. They're not demons or monsters in the moral sense. They're agents of cosmic balance, performing a necessary function that someone or something must perform if order is to be maintained. Without the Erinyes, blood guilt would go unpunished, family bonds would lose their sacred weight, and the fundamental structure of society, built on the idea that kinship creates unbreakable obligations, would collapse. Yet they're terrifying nonetheless, because they represent justice without mercy, vengeance without proportion, punishment without the possibility of forgiveness. They're what justice looks like when stripped of all softening elements, when reduced to its most basic form: you did wrong, therefore you will suffer. End of discussion. The Greeks both revered and feared them, calling them sometimes Erinyes, the angry ones, but also, euphemistically, Eumenides, the kindly ones, as if by using gentle names they might soften these spirits' terrible wrath. In Tartarus, the Erinyes have found their perfect home, a realm where their nature can be fully expressed without conflict, where every soul deserves exactly the harsh justice they embody. They seem almost pleased here, if such beings can be pleased, in their element among the damned, ensuring that divine verdicts are executed with precision and finality. They're the last piece of Tartarus's machinery, the enforcers who make all the judges' decisions, all the gods' punishments, actually happen rather than remaining theoretical. Watching them work, you feel the weight of ancient justice, of a time when crime and punishment were simpler, more immediate, less concerned with context or circumstances or the complicated factors that modern legal systems struggle to account for. The Erinyes don't care about your traumatic childhood or your mental state or whether you were coerced. They only care that you committed the crime, that blood was shed or oaths were broken or family was betrayed, and having determined that, they act. There's something almost refreshing about this simplicity, this clarity, even as it appalls. In a world where justice often seems complicated beyond comprehension, where legal proceedings stretch for years and outcomes seem arbitrary, the Erinyes offer certainty. You do the crime, you get the time being eternity, and there's no plea bargaining, no technicalities, no possibility that wealth or connections will shield you. It's harsh, yes, but it's also absolutely fair in its application. The Erinyes don't distinguish between prince and pauper, strong and weak. They only distinguish between guilty and innocent. This fairness, this absolute impartiality, is why they endure even after newer systems of justice arise, why even Zeus acknowledges their role and authority, why they have a place in Tartarus, despite being older than Olympian rule. Some functions are so fundamental that they transcend any particular era or system, and ensuring blood guilt is punished apparently qualifies as one of those functions. The Erinyes aren't relics of primitive justice. They're eternal principles given form, reminders that some crimes strike so deep into the structure of reality that they require primal responses, not sophisticated deliberation. Your journey through Tartarus approaches its conclusion now, and you've witnessed the complete system of eternal punishment, the judges who deliberate, the rivers that define emotional geography, the concept of hubris that makes certain crimes cosmic offences, the poetic justice that shapes punishments into perfect mirrors of crimes, and the Erinyes who enforce it all. It's a comprehensive vision of divine justice in all its terrible sophistication, a system designed to maintain cosmic order through demonstration and deterrence, through perfect punishments that teach perfect lessons to anyone witnessing them. The Greeks created this mythology not from cruelty but from profound understanding of human nature and social necessity. They knew that societies require shared beliefs about consequences, that cosmic order depends on everyone accepting their proper place, that certain boundaries must not be crossed regardless of temptation or opportunity. Tartarus is the ultimate expression of these principles, a place where violating cosmic law receives cosmic punishment, where hubris meets its inevitable fate, where clever mortals learn definitively that they're not clever enough, where violence against family receives violence eternal. As your guide leads you back toward the surface, back through the rivers and past the judges and across the Acheron one final time, you carry these lessons with you. You understand now that divine justice operates on principles different from mortal justice, that the gods maintain order through terror as much as love, that some crimes are considered worse than murder because they threaten reality's basic structure, and that punishment can be simultaneously excessive and perfectly calibrated depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The myths of Tartarus ask us to consider our own positions in whatever cosmic order we believe in, to recognize our limitations and respect them, to understand that cleverness isn't wisdom and strength isn't righteousness, to acknowledge that our actions ripple through systems larger than ourselves and can bring consequences we never anticipated. These are valuable lessons, even if we don't believe in literal underworlds or divine punishment, because they speak to eternal truths about human nature, about our tendency toward hubris, about our need for systems of justice that transcend individual will. You emerge at last into twilight, that space between underworld and mortal realm, and you breathe deeply of air that hasn't been processed through thousands of years of suffering. The weight of Tartarus lifts from your shoulders, though its memory remains, and you understand that you've been given a gift of perspective, a chance to see justice in its most extreme form and thereby better understand its more moderate expressions in everyday life. The boulder still rolls, the water still recedes, the wheel still spins, the vultures still feed, the jars still leak, and they always will. Eternal demonstrations of eternal principles, warnings carved into the very fabric of existence. But you're free to walk away, to return to mortal life with mortal problems and mortal consequences, and that freedom tastes sweeter now than it did before you understood how completely it could be taken away. Sleep well, dreamers, secure in the knowledge that whatever mistakes you've made, whatever errors you regret, you almost certainly haven't earned Tartarus. The bar for eternal punishment is mercifully high, requiring not just crime, but cosmic crime, not just error, but fundamental rejection of reality's basic principles. Most of us muddle through life making small mistakes and small amends, and for us, gentler fates await, the peaceful forgetting of the asphodel meadows, or perhaps, if we're fortunate and virtuous, the blessed fields of Elysium. But remember the lessons anyway. Remember that actions have consequences, that hubris leads to downfall, that cosmic order exists whether we acknowledge it or not, and that somewhere, in the Greek imagination if nowhere else, perfect justice waits for those who believe themselves beyond its reach. But there's a deeper layer to Tartarus we haven't yet explored, one that reveals the political nature of divine punishment, the way power justifies itself through the eternal suffering of its enemies. Before mortals ever populated Tartarus with their crimes of hubris and violence, before Sisyphus pushed his first boulder or Tantalus reached for his first unreachable fruit, Tartarus served another purpose entirely. It was the god's own political prison, the place where Zeus locked away those who challenged his rule and lost. Your guide leads you now toward the deepest region of Tartarus, past all the mortal punishments we've witnessed, to a place where the very stone seems older, where the darkness carries weight beyond simple absence of light. Here, in the absolute nadir of the underworld, imprisoned behind gates of bronze and walls that extend infinitely in both directions, lie the Titans, the old gods who ruled before Zeus, the defeated enemies of the Olympian order, serving sentences that will last until time itself unravels. The story of their imprisonment begins not in Tartarus, but on the peaks of two mountains, Olympus and Othrys, where the greatest war in Greek cosmology raged for 10 full divine years. The Titanomachy, as this war would be known, was more than a simple succession crisis. It was a fundamental clash between old and new, between primordial power and organized civilization, between Cronus's tyrannical rule and Zeus's promise of a different order. Understanding this war is essential to understanding Tartarus itself, because the prison was as much a political statement as a practical necessity. Cronus, the youngest of the original Titans, had overthrown his own father Erinyes by castrating him with a sickle provided by their mother Gaia. This act of patricidal violence established Cronus as king of the cosmos, ruler of what would later be called the Golden Age. But Cronus inherited his father's paranoia along with his throne, and when he received a prophecy that one of his own children would overthrow him just as he had overthrown Uranus, Cronus responded with a solution that seemed foolproof in its brutality. He devoured each child as soon as it was born. His wife Rhea, forced to watch her children disappear down Cronus's throat one after another, finally rebelled when her sixth child was born. This child was Zeus, and Rhea, with Gaia's help, substituted a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes for the infant, hiding Zeus away on the island of Crete where he was raised in secret by nymphs and fed on the milk of the goat Amalthea. Cronus, either too confident in his cleverness or too dulled by ruling, swallowed the stone without noticing the substitution, and his doom was sealed. Zeus grew to adulthood in hiding, learning of his true heritage, of his siblings imprisoned in their father's stomach, of the prophecy that declared him destined to overthrow the Titan king. But destiny and ability are different things, and Zeus understood that defeating Cronus would require more than personal power. It would require allies, strategy, weapons that could match primordial strength, and above all, it would require freeing those who had as much reason to hate the current order as he did. His first act was to force Cronus to regurgitate his swallowed children using a potion provided by the Oceanid Metis, goddess of cunning intelligence. One by one, Cronus vomited forth Zeus's siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, all fully grown despite their years of imprisonment, emerging ready for war. These six, the original Olympians, formed the core of the rebellion, but they were far from sufficient to defeat the Titans, who possessed the accumulated power of the first generation of gods, beings who embodied fundamental forces of nature itself. Zeus's next move demonstrated the political sophistication that would characterize his rule. He descended into Tartarus itself, the prison where Cronus had confined the Cyclopes and the Hecaton chairs, monstrous beings imprisoned not for crimes but simply because Cronus feared their power. Cronus had placed Campe, a horrific dragon woman, as their jailer, ensuring these potential allies remained locked away. Zeus killed Campe, demonstrating that he was willing to fight for liberation, not just his own power, and freed the prisoners. The Cyclopes, grateful for their freedom and recognizing Zeus's potential, forged 3 weapons that would become symbols of Olympian power: the thunderbolt for Zeus, the trident for Poseidon, and the helmet of invisibility for Hades. These weren't mere objects but embodiments of the new god's nature, Zeus with his sky-ruling authority, Poseidon with his command of waters, Hades with his dominion over the unseen. Meanwhile, the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants, pledged their immense strength to Zeus's cause, adding raw power to complement the weapon's sophistication. Not all Titans sided with Cronus. This detail matters enormously. Oceanus, the great world-encircling river, refused to fight, perhaps recognizing that cosmic order required him regardless of who ruled, or perhaps simply unwilling to risk his position in a war that might go either way. Themis, goddess of divine law, sided with Zeus, lending him legitimacy and the claim that his rebellion represented justice rather than mere ambition. Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus also joined the Olympian cause, Prometheus's foresight telling him that Zeus would triumph and that supporting the eventual winner was wise strategy. Even some of Oceanus's children joined Zeus, most notably Styx, the goddess of the river that would bear her name, who brought her own children: Nike, Kratos, Bia, and Zelus, victory, power, force, and zeal to fight for the Olympians. This defection was crucial, both practically and symbolically, because it meant that even Titan offspring recognized Zeus's claim as legitimate, that the war wasn't simply young versus old, but represented a genuine choice between 2 visions of how the cosmos should be governed. The war itself raged for 10 divine years, which translates to considerably longer in mortal time, a cosmic conflict that shook the foundations of reality itself. The Titans fought from Mount Othrys, their traditional stronghold, while the Olympians established their base on Mount Olympus, the peak that would become synonymous with divine power. The fighting was apocalyptic in scale, Zeus hurling thunderbolts that scorched the earth, Poseidon summoning earthquakes and tidal waves, the hecatoncheires hurling boulders by the hundreds simultaneously, their 100 hands working in terrifying synchronization. Ancient sources describe the earth itself groaning under the weight of this conflict, mountains being hurled like weapons, the sea boiling from the heat of Zeus's lightning, the very fabric of space and time straining under the force of primordial powers clashing without restraint. This wasn't war as mortals understood it, with armies and tactics and territorial objectives. This was existence itself being renegotiated through violence, the fundamental question of who gets to define reality being answered through force of arms. Eventually, inevitably, the Olympians prevailed, their superior tactics and powerful allies overwhelming the Titans' raw strength. Zeus's thunderbolts proved decisive, the focused, directed power of the new order overcoming the diffuse might of the old. When the final battle concluded, Zeus faced a choice about what to do with the defeated Titans, and this choice reveals much about his nature and the nature of the order he was establishing. He could have destroyed them. Some sources suggest this was within his power, erasing the old gods entirely and starting fresh. But Zeus chose imprisonment instead, and that choice was profoundly political, a demonstration that the new order was strong enough not just to defeat its enemies, but to keep them permanently defeated, to maintain them in eternal suffering as a reminder of what happens to those who challenge Olympian authority. Destruction would have ended the Titans' threat, but imprisonment turned them into perpetual proof of Zeus's power. So the Titans, all those who had fought against Zeus, were cast into Tartarus. Hesiod describes it vividly. They were bound in chains and hurled into the deepest part of the underworld, a place as far beneath Hades as heaven is above earth, surrounded by triple layers of darkness and enclosed behind bronze gates set in foundations stronger than any mortal work. And, as guards for this cosmic prison, Zeus appointed the hecatoncheires, the very beings Cronus had imprisoned, turning victims into jailers in a reversal that must have carried its own terrible poetry. You stand now before the prison that houses them, and even from outside you can sense the weight of their presence. These are not mortal souls, but beings who existed before humanity, who embodied elements of reality itself, now reduced to prisoners serving infinite sentences for the crime of backing the wrong side in a war of succession. Through gaps in the bronze gates, you catch glimpses of them, Cronus himself, the king who devoured his children, now himself consumed by time's passage with nothing to show for it, Iapetus, father of Atlas and Prometheus, Hyperion and Theia, the parents of the sun, moon, and dawn, all of them sharing this eternal prison. The conditions of their imprisonment are worth noting. They don't suffer specific torments like the mortal residents of Tartarus. There's no boulder to push or fruit to reach. Their punishment is simpler and perhaps more terrible in its simplicity. They exist in complete powerlessness. Beings who once commanded fundamental forces now unable to affect anything, trapped in darkness without purpose or hope of release. They can see neither the sun that was once under their dominion nor feel any breeze. They exist in stasis, neither dead nor truly alive, simply held in a state of permanent defeat. Some sources suggest Zeus eventually relented and freed certain titans, that Cronus was allowed to rule Elysium, the paradise fields, turning a defeated enemy into an administrator of reward, a position of honor, but notably not power. This version, if true, demonstrates Zeus's sophistication as a ruler, knowing when to show mercy, when to turn enemies into subordinates, rather than maintaining them as prisoners. But even in these accounts, the Titans' freedom is conditional, granted by Zeus and therefore revocable. They remain ultimately subject to Olympian authority even if no longer actively imprisoned. Atlas received special punishment, separated from his fellow Titans and condemned to hold up the sky for eternity, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. This punishment is particularly revealing because it combines the practical with the symbolic. Someone had to hold the sky, in Greek cosmological thinking, and making it a defeated Titan served as perpetual reminder of Olympian victory. Every time anyone looked up and saw the sky remaining in place, they were witnessing the punishment of Zeus's enemies, seeing the old order literally holding up the new. The political dimensions of the Titan's imprisonment become clearer when you consider that Tartarus was already functioning as a prison before any mortals were condemned there. The very concept of eternal punishment for challenging divine authority was established not through moral reasoning but through political necessity. Zeus needed somewhere to put his defeated enemies, somewhere they could never escape from, somewhere their suffering could serve as warning and their powerlessness as demonstration. Only later did this political prison become a moral one, with mortals who committed particular crimes being sent to join the Titans in their eternal exile. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice in the Greek cosmos. If Tartarus was first a political tool and only secondarily a moral institution, then what does that say about the punishments we've witnessed? Are Sisyphus and Tantalus and the others really being punished for moral offences? Or are they, like the Titans, simply examples of what happens when you challenge the system Zeus established? The Greeks, to their credit, didn't flinch from these questions. They understood that divine justice and divine politics were inseparable, that the gods maintained order through power as much as through righteousness. There's also the question of proportionality. The Titans fought a war and lost, a fairly straightforward political outcome, yet their punishment is eternal. No parole, no chance of redemption, no possibility that after sufficient suffering they might be deemed to have paid their debt. This seems excessive by any moral framework, but it makes perfect sense as political theatre. Permanent imprisonment demonstrates permanent power, suggests that Zeus's authority is so secure that he can afford to keep his enemies alive but helpless, that his victory was so complete it will never need to be reaffirmed. Honestly, thinking about the Titan's imprisonment from a political philosophy perspective, does eternal punishment for finite rebellion seem justified? For me, the answer reveals more about what we think power is for, whether it's meant to maintain order or to help subjects flourish, because those different purposes lead to very different conclusions about proportional punishment. Your guide leads you away from the Titan's prison back toward regions populated by mortal souls, and the contrast is striking. The mortals at least earned their punishments through choices they made, however warped by hubris or passion, while the Titans are here simply for being on the losing side of a cosmic power struggle. Both groups suffer eternally, but only one can claim their suffering has moral justification beyond political expediency, and that distinction matters even if it doesn't change the reality of Tartarus's bronze gates and unbreakable chains. We turn our attention now to the infrastructure of death itself, to the beings who maintain the underworld's daily operations without judgment or malice, simply performing eternal duties that someone must perform if the boundary between life and death is to remain stable. These are not the dramatic figures of mythology, not heroes or monsters or gods in any traditional sense, but rather the bureaucrats of death, the workers who keep the system functioning regardless of who rules or why. You've encountered them already, Charon the ferryman and Cerberus the guardian hound, but we've moved past them quickly, focused on more dramatic destinations. Now we return to consider them more carefully, to understand what it means to serve in these positions, to have roles so essential that they transcend any particular regime or moral framework, to be, in effect, the eternal middle management of the underworld. Charon stands at his ferry as he has stood for uncounted ages, a figure carved from time itself, his face hidden beneath a hood, his hands gnarled around the pole he uses to propel his boat across the Acheron's dark waters. Ancient sources disagree on his parentage. some making him son of Nyx night and Erebus darkness, others suggesting even more primordial origins, but all agree on his function. He transports souls from the land of the living to the land of the dead, and he has been doing this since before Zeus overthrew the Titans, before the Olympians claimed dominion, possibly since death itself became a distinct state from life. What strikes you most about Charon is his absolute neutrality. He doesn't judge the souls he transports, doesn't care whether they were virtuous or wicked, heroes or villains, doesn't distinguish between kings and beggars, except in the single detail of whether they can pay his fee. The obol, the small coin placed in or on corpses by their living relatives, is all Charon requires, and those who possess it receive passage, while those who lack it must wait by the river's edge for 100 years before being allowed to cross. This mercenary quality might seem cruel, but it reveals something profound about death's nature. It's transactional rather than moral. A boundary that must be crossed through proper procedure regardless of who's crossing or why. Charon embodies this principle. He's not evil, not vindictive, not even particularly interested in the souls he ferries. He's simply performing a function that must be performed, moving souls from one state to another, maintaining the boundary between worlds. The requirement of the coin carries its own philosophy. It means the living have responsibilities to the dead, that proper burial and proper payment matter, that dying doesn't sever all social bonds but rather transforms them into obligations the living must fulfill. Those who die without proper burial, whose bodies are lost at sea or consumed by beasts or simply abandoned, must wait beside the Acheron because their living relatives failed them. It's a system that reinforces family and community bonds, that makes death a collective concern rather than purely individual fate. Charon's eternal duty raises questions we seldom consider. What is it like to ferry millions upon millions of souls, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, never resting, never varying your routine, never achieving anything except the perpetual maintenance of a boundary? Does Charon experience something like boredom, or has he transcended such mortal concerns? Does he remember individual souls, or do they blur into an endless stream of shades requiring transport? Is his work satisfaction enough, the simple pleasure of performing a necessary task with complete competence, or does he long for something else, some change, The Greeks don't tell us. They're not particularly interested in Charon's inner life, and perhaps that's appropriate, because he represents function divorced from personality, duty divorced from desire, the pure performance of a role that must be filled regardless of who fills it. He's the ultimate civil servant, the eternal bureaucrat, and there's something both admirable and horrifying in that completeness of purpose. Watching him work, you notice how efficiently he moves, how economically he poles his boat, how precisely he judges the weight of souls and the current of the river, never wasting motion, never hurrying, simply proceeding at the exact pace required to move souls from shore to shore in optimal time. It's hypnotic in its repetitiveness, this endless cycle of arrival, boarding, crossing, disembarkation, return, and it speaks to a view of death as process rather than event, something that happens continuously rather than occasionally, requiring infrastructure and maintenance and beings willing to dedicate eternity to keeping it running. Beyond Charon's ferry, past the river, Cerberus guards the gates, and if Charon represents death's transactional nature, Cerberus embodies its inescapability. The three-headed hound is massive beyond any living dog, his size alone sufficient to deter most escape attempts, but size is perhaps his least impressive attribute. Each of his three heads sees in different directions simultaneously, ensuring no blind spots, no angle of approach that might allow someone to slip past undetected. His serpent tail adds a fourth source of vigilance, writhing and watching with its own venomous awareness. But Cerberus's true power lies not in physical might, but in his fundamental nature. He is the boundary made flesh, the embodiment of death's one-way passage, and his duty is simple: ensure that the dead enter but do not leave, and prevent the living from entering unless they have specific permission from the gods. This makes him simultaneously welcoming and terrifying. He greets arriving souls with almost friendly interest. Some sources suggest he wags his serpent tail for newcomers, but he attacks with savage fury anyone attempting to exit without authorization. His position is lonely in ways Charon's is not. Charon at least interacts with every soul that crosses, however briefly and impersonally, but Cerberus simply sits, watching, waiting, ready to fulfill his function, but rarely required to actually do so. Most souls accept their state and don't attempt escape, and living mortals almost never attempt to enter, so Cerberus spends the vast majority of his eternal existence simply being present, being a deterrent, being the reminder that this boundary exists and will be enforced. The few times heroes did attempt to pass Cerberus, their methods reveal his nature. Heracles overpowered him through brute strength, wrestling the hound into submission in what was essentially a test of power. Orpheus charmed him with music so beautiful that even the guardian of death was lulled into sleep, and in some versions, the Sibyl accompanying Aeneas threw him drugged honeycakes, appealing to his canine nature despite his divine status. Each method worked once, but none changed Cerberus's fundamental function. He resumed his duty as soon as the hero passed, resuming his eternal watch without apparent resentment or fatigue. There's something profoundly sad about Cerberus. When you consider him closely, he's a dog, that most loyal and devoted of animals, but he has no master in any meaningful sense. Hades doesn't pet him or play with him, doesn't offer rewards for good service or punishment for failure. Cerberus simply is, existing in his role without relationship, without companionship beyond the brief moments when souls arrive or heroes attempt passage. He's the loneliest guard in all mythology, serving with perfect loyalty not from love but from being, unable to imagine any existence other than this one, any purpose beyond watching the gate. Yet there's also dignity in his position. He's trusted with perhaps the most important boundary in all existence, the one between life and death, between the mutable and the fixed, between possibility and conclusion, and he's never failed in his duty, never let the wrong souls through, never allowed unauthorized passage. That kind of perfect reliability over eons of service demands respect even as it provokes pity, because it speaks to a completeness of purpose that mortals can aspire to but rarely achieve. Together, Charon and Cerberus form the infrastructure of death, one moving souls to their destination, the other ensuring they remain there. Two aspects of the same fundamental function, maintaining boundaries and processing transitions. They're not evil, not good, not heroic, not villainous. They're simply essential, the workers without whom the entire system of death would collapse into chaos. The Greeks understood something modern mythology often forgets. Grand cosmic schemes require logistics, require beings willing to perform unglamorous duties eternally, require infrastructure maintained by those who will never receive glory or gratitude, but without whom nothing else functions. The thought occurs to you as you watch Cerberus return to his position and Charon pole away for his next passenger that perhaps these roles are more central to Greek thought than the dramatic punishments and the elaborate judgments. Perhaps the real message is that existence requires structure, requires boundaries, requires beings willing to enforce those boundaries not from cruelty, but from necessity. It's a more sophisticated philosophy than simple reward and punishment, acknowledging that systems matter as much as individuals, that maintenance is as important as creation, that the unglamorous work of keeping things running deserves recognition even if it doesn't inspire epic poetry. From the infrastructure of death, we turn now to those who defied it, who attempted what should be impossible and in a few rare cases succeeded, living heroes who descended into the underworld and returned to tell the tale. These journeys, called katabasis in Greek, represent a special category of mythological narrative, stories about crossing the ultimate boundary and coming back, about confronting death directly while still alive and carrying that knowledge back to the mortal world. The most famous katabasis belongs to Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, whose journey to the underworld forms Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey. But Odysseus's descent differs from most others in a crucial way. He doesn't actually enter the underworld proper. Instead, he sails to its edges, to a place where the living world and the land of the dead nearly touch, and there performs rituals to summon shades of the dead to speak with him. He comes seeking knowledge, specifically the wisdom of the prophet Tiresias, who, even in death, possesses the gift of seeing the future. Homer describes Odysseus digging a pit and filling it with offerings, libations of honey and milk and wine, and finally sacrificing sheep so their blood flows into the pit and the shades come, drawn by the blood's promise of temporary strength, temporary ability to remember and speak clearly. Odysseus wards them away from the blood until Tiresias arrives, allowing the prophet first drink so he can deliver his prophecy about Odysseus's journey home, warning of dangers ahead and advising how to navigate them. But having summoned the dead, Odysseus lingers to speak with others, his mother Anticlea, who died of grief waiting for his return, Agamemnon, whose shade still burns with rage at his murder by his own wife, Achilles, who famously declares he would rather be a living slave than a dead king, revealing that even the greatest of Greek heroes finds no satisfaction in the afterlife's glory. These conversations transform Odysseus's katabasis from mere information gathering into philosophical meditation on mortality, on what's lost in death, on whether fame and glory actually compensate for the loss of life itself. Odysseus also witnesses the punishments, seeing Tityos with his liver being eaten, Tantalus reaching vainly for water and fruit, Sisyphus pushing his boulder, observing firsthand what we've explored in such detail. For him, these sights serve as warnings, demonstrations of what happens when mortals offend the gods, and he carries this knowledge back to the living world, sharing it through Homer's poem with countless generations who learn from the suffering of the damned. His catabasis demonstrates something crucial about Greek conceptions of knowledge, that true wisdom requires confronting death, requires understanding not just intellectually but viscerally, what mortality means, what's lost when life ends, what remains of human consciousness in the afterlife. Odysseus returns to the mortal world changed, carrying knowledge that shapes his remaining choices, that informs his eventual return to Ithaca and his reclamation of his throne and family. Very different is Heracles' katabasis, which represents the heroic approach to the underworld, confronting death through strength rather than wisdom, imposing mortal will on the realm of the dead through sheer force of personality and muscle. Heracles descended to Hades as his 12th and final labor, commanded to retrieve Cerberus and bring the hound to the surface without using weapons, purely through wrestling prowess. This labor differed from Heracles' others because it required permission. You couldn't simply assault the underworld and steal its guardian. Even Heracles understood that, so he underwent initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred rites that promised better treatment in the afterlife, and apparently granted some rite of passage to the living. Thus prepared, Heracles descended, and his journey demonstrates power rather than subtlety. He demanded passage rather than requesting it, confronted Hades himself, and received permission to attempt taking Cerberus on the condition that no weapons were used. The wrestling match between Heracles and the three-headed hound must have been spectacular, hero and monster grappling. Heracles' legendary strength pitted against Cerberus's divine nature and multiple sets of fangs. Eventually, Heracles prevailed, getting the hound in a chokehold that even Cerberus couldn't escape, and carried the defeated guardian to the surface, showing him to Eurystheus, who commissioned the labors, and then, crucially, returning him to his post. The labor was about demonstrating power, about proving Heracles could conquer even death's guardian, but it didn't challenge the fundamental order. Cerberus was borrowed and returned, not destroyed or permanently removed. During his descent, Heracles also encountered Theseus and Pirithous, stuck to their chairs in eternal punishment for attempting to kidnap Persephone. Heracles managed to free Theseus. Accounts vary on how, but when he tried to release Pirithous, the earth shook in warning. Pirithous' crime was too severe, his punishment too fundamental to cosmic order, and even Heracles' strength couldn't override divine decree. This detail matters. It shows that catabasis, even heroic catabasis, has limits, that some boundaries cannot be crossed, some punishments cannot be appealed, some aspects of death's authority remain inviolate regardless of mortal power. But the most famous catabasis, the one that has inspired countless artistic recreations and philosophical meditations, belongs to Orpheus, the legendary musician whose descent was motivated not by duty or knowledge-seeking, but by love. When Orpheus's new bride Eurydice died from a snakebite while fleeing unwanted attention, Orpheus's grief was so profound that he decided to do what no one should attempt, to descend into death itself and bring her back. His method was music. Orpheus played his lyre and sang with such beauty that he charmed every obstacle he encountered. Charon ferried him across without payment. Cerberus sat docile instead of attacking. Even the Furies paused in their duties to listen, tears forming in eyes that had forgotten how to weep. When Orpheus reached Hades and Persephone's throne, he sang them a song of love and loss, so moving that even the king and queen of the dead were touched. Persephone, especially, herself a victim of forced separation from loved ones, convinced her husband to allow an unprecedented mercy. Hades agreed that Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the living world, but imposed one condition: Orpheus must walk ahead and not look back until both had reached the surface, must trust that she followed without visual confirmation. This condition seems cruel, but it reveals something profound about death's nature, that it must be accepted before it can be overcome, that looking back means clinging to what's lost, that truly leaving death behind requires faith in forward motion rather than backward glancing. Orpheus almost succeeded. He walked through the underworld and began the ascent, hearing footsteps behind him but seeing nothing, trusting that Eurydice followed, fighting every instinct to turn and verify her presence. But at the last moment, just as light from the upper world became visible, doubt overcame faith. Orpheus turned to see if Eurydice was truly there, and in that moment she was pulled back to the underworld forever, his one glance breaking the condition and sealing her permanent death. Some versions say he saw her just before she vanished, one last glimpse of what he'd lost, while others suggest he saw nothing, that she was already fading even as he turned, that his doubt itself destroyed what love had nearly rescued. The tragedy of Orpheus's catabasis has resonated for millennia because it speaks to universal human experiences, the inability to let go of what we've lost, the way doubt undermines faith at crucial moments, the terrible irony that the very intensity of love can become the thing that dooms it. Orpheus looked back because he loved Eurydice so much he couldn't bear uncertainty, yet that look destroyed any possibility of reunion. It's a myth about the limits of even the purest emotions, about how death changes the rules and we cannot negotiate with it using mortal assumptions. After losing Eurydice a second time, Orpheus never loved another, eventually being torn apart by Maenads, followers of Dionysus, for refusing their advances, his severed head continuing to sing even as it floated down the river Hubris. And in death, finally, he was reunited with Eurydice in the underworld, able to walk with her eternally, since neither could now return to life. It's a reunion achieved through complete surrender rather than heroic rescue, suggesting that death can only be joined, not overcome, that love's ultimate expression might be acceptance of mortality rather than resistance to it. These three catabases, Odysseus seeking knowledge, Heracles demonstrating power, and Orpheus pursuing love, represent different approaches to the fundamental problem of mortality, different ways humans attempt to come to terms with death's inevitability and finality. Odysseus accepts death but seeks to understand it, to know what awaits and how to make peace with it. Heracles challenges death directly, proving mortal strength can contend with even death's guardians, while ultimately accepting he cannot abolish death itself. And Orpheus tries to reverse death through love, failing but demonstrating that the attempt itself has value, that love makes us reach for the impossible even when reason tells us we'll fail. Each hero returns changed. or in Orpheus's case, destroyed and transformed, carrying knowledge that separates them from those who haven't confronted death directly, having seen what we've seen tonight, the machinery of the underworld, the punishments of the damned, the rivers and judges, and the simple fact that death is a place, a state, a condition that can be visited and observed, even if it cannot ultimately be escaped. The Catabasis tradition suggests that full human development requires confronting mortality, requires the descent into death's realm while still living, so that the return to life carries deeper meaning. Which Catabasis do you find most philosophically compelling? For me, it's Orpheus, because there's something profound in the idea that love drives us to attempt the impossible, that the very attempt has value even when it fails, that looking back means we're human, even when being human dooms us. These journeys also reveal something crucial we haven't discussed directly, that the Greek afterlife, for all its permanence and structure, isn't absolutely sealed. Heroes can visit, shades can be summoned, the boundary between life and death, while real and enforced, has permeability under certain conditions. This distinguishes Greek thought from more absolute conceptions of death, acknowledging that the living and dead exist in different states but not in completely separate realities, that communication and even temporary reunions are possible, if difficult and dangerous. Now we must confront perhaps the starkest difference between Greek afterlife beliefs and many modern religious conceptions: the absolute absence of redemption in Tartarus, the complete lack of any mechanism for forgiveness, reform, or eventual release. This isn't accidental or oversight, it's fundamental to how the Greeks understood divine justice, and examining it reveals a worldview profoundly different from ones shaped by religions emphasizing mercy and second chances. In modern Western religious thought, particularly Christianity, punishment serves multiple purposes, retribution certainly, but also reformation. The punishment is meant to change the sinner, to burn away evil and leave purified good, to teach lessons that transform character, so the punished soul can eventually rejoin the blessed. Even hell in many Christian theological frameworks exists to purify through suffering, or at minimum serves as choice. The damned are there because they rejected salvation, not because salvation was impossible. Tartarus operates on entirely different principles. Punishment here is purely retributive, existing to make the guilty suffer in proportion to their crimes, or perhaps more accurately, to make them suffer eternally regardless of proportion, demonstrating divine authority's absolute nature. There is no reformation because reformation isn't the point. Sisyphus will never learn from his boulder because the boulder isn't meant to teach, it's meant to punish. Tantalus will never develop virtue from his hunger because hunger isn't pedagogy, it's consequence. This absence of redemption stems from the Greek understanding of action and consequence as irreversible. What's done cannot be undone, and certain acts create permanent stains that no amount of suffering will remove. The crime becomes part of the criminal's essential nature, defining them forever rather than being something external that might be corrected. Sisyphus isn't a good person who made bad choices. He is his choices. His cleverness turned to deception defines his being, and being cannot be reformed, only expressed or suppressed. The gods themselves demonstrate this principle. They don't learn from mistakes in ways that change their fundamental natures. Zeus remains the thunderbolt-wielding authority regardless of how many affairs end badly. Hera stays jealous. Despite millennia of pain caused by that jealousy, Poseidon continues temperamental, whether his rages serve him well or poorly. Divine nature is fixed, and mortals, being created by and subject to these gods, inherit some of this fixedness. Character is fate, and fate cannot be revised, only fulfilled. This creates a worldview where moral choice matters tremendously and permanently. If there's no redemption, no second chances, no opportunity to erase past mistakes through subsequent virtue, then every choice carries absolute weight. You are building your eternal fate with each decision, creating the self that will persist forever without possibility of transformation. It's simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means you're genuinely creating yourself rather than being molded by outside forces. Terrifying because errors are permanent and consequences eternal. The judges of the dead reflect this understanding. They don't ask whether you've repented or learned or grown. They examine your life as a complete thing, a finished work whose quality determines eternal placement. Minos doesn't care if Sisyphus regrets his deceptions. The deceptions happened. They define him. They earn him his punishment regardless of subsequent emotional states. Rhadamanthus doesn't weigh current virtue against past vice. He evaluates the life as lived, and that life either merits Elysium or doesn't, with no intermediate option for gradual improvement. This absence of mercy might seem cruel from our perspective, shaped by religions promising forgiveness to the truly repentant, but the Greeks found different consolations in their system. It meant justice was certain, that crimes would definitely receive punishment, that virtue would definitely receive reward, without the uncertainty introduced by concepts like grace or redemption that might override just deserts. If you lived virtuously, you were guaranteed Elysium. If you lived ordinarily, the asphodel meadows awaited, and if you committed genuine atrocities, Tartarus would claim you, simple, predictable, certain. It also meant that moral responsibility was absolute. You couldn't appeal to divine mercy or claim extenuating circumstances or hope that sincere apology would erase consequences. You owned your actions completely, and they owned you in return, defining your eternal nature without appeal. This might actually be more respectful of human agency than systems offering forgiveness, because it treats your choices as genuinely yours, as serious expressions of will, rather than mistakes that can be erased through proper ritual or sufficient contrition. The contrast with Elysium makes this absence of redemption particularly stark. Those who reach paradise remain there eternally, enjoying peaceful existence without fear of punishment, even if they committed minor wrongs during life, while those in Tartarus suffer eternally without hope of improvement, even if they develop virtue in their suffering. The two states are permanent and separate, with no traffic between them, no graduated system where you might suffer in Tartarus for a time and then be promoted to better conditions based on good behaviour. Some later Greek philosophical schools, particularly Orphism and Pythagoreanism, developed concepts of reincarnation and soul purification that created possibilities for improvement through multiple lifetimes. Souls might be punished in the afterlife, then reborn to try again, gradually working towards sufficient purity to escape the cycle entirely. But these were minority beliefs, and even they didn't suggest Tartarus itself offered reformation. The suffering there simply balanced cosmic accounts before the soul moved to its next incarnation. The mainstream Greek view, reflected in Homer and Hesiod and the popular myths, held that death fixed your nature permanently. You became in death what you had been in life, only more so, with all pretense stripped away and all masks removed, leaving only the essential self that had been forming through your mortal choices, and that self would persist forever without substantial change, experiencing consequences appropriate to its nature, but never transforming into something fundamentally different. This explains why proper living mattered so intensely to the Greeks, why they developed such sophisticated ethical frameworks, why honor and virtue and excellence weren't merely nice ideals, but literally the difference between eternal paradise and eternal torment or eternal monotony. You were creating your forever self with every choice, and no future revision was possible. What you built during your mortal years was what you'd inhabit for all eternity. The absence of redemption also means the underworld functions as perfect memory. Every action is recorded and evaluated, nothing is forgotten or forgiven. The judges possess complete knowledge of your life, and that knowledge determines eternal fate without possibility of appeal or revision. History cannot be rewritten, only accepted, and the consequences of that history become permanent conditions rather than temporary states. In this framework, the gods' refusal to offer redemption isn't cruelty, but honesty. They're acknowledging that character doesn't fundamentally change, that what you are determines what you do, and what you do reveals what you are. In an endless loop where agency and nature intertwine, Sisyphus's punishment doesn't make him humble because Sisyphus cannot be humble. Humility would require being someone other than Sisyphus, and becoming someone else is impossible once death has fixed your nature in place. Modern sensibilities often find this harsh. We prefer to believe people can change, that transformation is possible, that no one is beyond redemption if they genuinely seek it. But the Greeks understood something we sometimes forget, that wanting to change and being able to change are different things, that nature imposes constraints even on will, that some patterns run so deep they cannot be altered, only expressed or suppressed, and death strips away all suppression, leaving only the naked pattern of who you truly were. This worldview has its own terrible beauty, its own consistency, its own logic that demands we take seriously. The proposition that existence has stakes, that choices matter absolutely, that we are creating something permanent through our daily actions, whether we acknowledge it or not. The Greeks simply made explicit what's implicit in all serious moral thinking, that character is destiny, and that destiny, once realized, persists. But we cannot leave this exploration in Tartarus's darkness without acknowledging the other destinations, the places where souls not condemned to punishment reside. Because the Greek underworld wasn't entirely grim, it contained spaces of neutral rest and even paradise, and understanding these alternatives provides essential context for why Tartarus's punishment seemed justified to those who believed in them. The asphodel meadows received the vast majority of souls, all those who lived ordinary lives, neither heroic nor heinous, simply existing in the grey middle ground where most human experience actually resides. These souls weren't punished, but neither were they particularly rewarded. They simply continued in a diminished state, shades rather than full beings, conscious but dreamlike, aware but disconnected, existing in peaceful monotony forever. Homer describes the asphodel meadows as a place of faded existence, where shades retain memories but lack the vitality to act on them, where consciousness persists but purpose dissipates, where being continues but meaning evaporates. It's not torture, but neither is it satisfaction, simply endless grey continuation, appropriate perhaps for lives that were neither dramatically good nor dramatically bad, that simply were without particular moral character. The landscape of the asphodel meadows matches its inhabitants' state, fields of pale flowers, asphodels that never bloom fully, dim light that never brightens today or darkens tonight, silence broken only by whispers and sighs, nothing actively unpleasant but nothing appealing either, existence reduced to its minimum, consciousness without content, being without becoming. Achilles' famous complaint to Odysseus during the latter's catabasis sums up the asphodel meadows' nature. He says he would rather be a living slave, the poorest and most oppressed of mortals, than king of all the dead, revealing that even honored heroes find the afterlife unsatisfying, that glory and fame mean nothing without the vitality of life, without purpose and agency, and the possibility of change, all of which the asphodel meadows lacks. Yet it's still preferable to Tartarus. At least you're not actively suffering. At least your existence is peaceful even if meaningless. At least you're not locked in eternal futile labor or eternal frustrated desire. The asphodel meadows represent baseline afterlife, neither reward nor punishment, just continuation in the absence of body and purpose and the capacity for meaningful action. Souls in the asphodel meadows can communicate when blood or libations strengthen them temporarily, returning some vitality and memory, which is why Odysseus's ritual was effective. But without such external intervention they drift in dreamlike states, dimly aware of their surroundings and past lives, but lacking energy to care deeply or act on their awareness. It's existence without engagement, being without doing. This fate awaited most Greeks. They didn't expect paradise or fear particular punishment. They expected to end up in the asphodel meadows, consciousness gradually fading into peaceful monotony, and this expectation shaped how they lived, since glory was one of the few things that might transcend such fading. being remembered by the living maintained some vitality even in death. Epic poetry kept heroes more alive in the asphodel meadows than obscurity allowed for ordinary shades. The contrast to Tartarus is obvious. Both are eternal, but one involves active suffering while the other involves passive existence. One deliberately torments while the other simply continues without particular quality. One requires constant divine enforcement while the other simply is, requiring no maintenance or oversight. Souls settle into the asphodel meadows like sediment settling in still water, finding their natural level and remaining there without drama or change. But the Greeks also conceived paradise, Elysium or the Elysian fields, sometimes called the Isles of the Blessed, a realm of perfect peace and happiness reserved for the virtuous, the heroic, and those specially favored by gods. Here souls retained full vitality, could engage in activities they loved in life, existed in perpetual pleasant weather and abundant nature, without suffering or want or fear. It was genuine reward for genuine virtue or achievement. Early versions placed Elysium at the far western edge of the world, in the stream of ocean, physically separate from the underworld proper, but later conceptions integrated it into Hades' realm, making it a region within the underworld but separated from the gloom by the river Lethe. Rhadamanthus presided over Elysium, or in some versions Cronus himself, turned from defeated enemy into administrator of paradise, ensuring that those who merited reward received it without corruption or diminishment. Elysium represented what the Greeks most valued, not passive pleasure but active engagement in meaningful pursuits. Heroes could continue the excellence they demonstrated in life, warriors could engage in friendly combat without death's risk, poets could compose, athletes could compete, all in perfect conditions without the suffering and uncertainty that plagued mortal existence. It was life's best qualities extended eternally without life's pains and limitations. Access to Elysium could be earned through exceptional virtue or granted through divine favor or achieved through initiation into certain mystery religions that promised better afterlives to their initiates. This created multiple paths to paradise, recognizing that excellence takes various forms and that divine mercy might supplement human merit. It wasn't purely meritocratic, but neither was it arbitrary. The judges evaluated both deeds and divine connections in determining who merited Elysium's blessed existence. Some philosophical systems added reincarnation to the framework, suggesting souls might cycle through multiple lives, and those who achieved virtue in 3 consecutive incarnations would finally be released to Elysium permanently, freed from the cycle of birth and death, residing eternally in paradise. This added a dynamic element to an otherwise static system, suggesting that patient accumulation of virtue across lifetimes could eventually transcend normal human limitations. Elysium's existence was crucial to the moral framework that justified Tartarus. Without paradise for the virtuous, eternal punishment for the wicked would seem merely cruel, but with Elysium balancing Tartarus, with the asphodel meadows providing neutral middle ground, the system achieved a kind of symmetry. Extreme virtue receives extreme reward, extreme vice receives extreme punishment, and ordinary existence receives extreme punishment, and ordinary existence receives ordinary continuation. It's a cosmos organized by merit and consequence, where justice operates absolutely, even if not always, obviously. Your journey through the underworld approaches completion now. You've witnessed punishment and neutrality, infrastructure and exception, the political prisons of defeated gods and the moral prisons of failed humans. You've seen the rivers that define emotional geography and the judges who determine eternal fates. You've walked with Charon and passed Cerberus, observed catabases and understood the absence of redemption, seen the asphodel meadows as pale peace, and heard descriptions of Elysium's bright reward. The complete picture reveals a cosmos of perfect accounting where nothing is forgotten, all is evaluated, and consequences persist eternally, appropriate to the nature of what was done and who did it. It's harsh by some measures, offering no second chances and no erasure of past mistakes, but it's also perfectly fair in its unflinching application, treating all equally, judging by consistent standards, maintaining cosmic order through absolute fidelity to principle rather than situational mercy. As your guide leads you toward the final ascent, back through the layers of the underworld toward the mortal realm, you carry these images and insights with you, understanding that Greek mythology offered sophisticated philosophy, disguised as stories about gods and heroes and punishments, each myth teaching lessons about consequences and character, about what matters and what endures, about how to live knowing that death is not end but transformation, not escape but reckoning. The Greeks built this elaborate mythology not from morbid fascination with death, but from profound engagement with life. They wanted to understand what mattered, what persisted, what defined human existence beyond the temporary pleasures and pains of daily experience, and they concluded that character was everything, that choices created permanent patterns, that justice operated absolutely even when slowly, that the cosmos maintained perfect accounts even when mortal perspective couldn't perceive them. These lessons remain relevant even for those who don't believe in literal underworlds or divine judges, because they speak to permanent truths about consequence and character, about how our actions define us, about the impossibility of escaping what we've done, about the importance of living with integrity when integrity is tested. The myths of Tartarus and Elysium and the Asphodel Meadows are metaphors for states we create through living, hells of our own making, paradises earned through persistent excellence, and neutral continuations of habits established over lifetimes. Sleep well tonight, dreamers. Grateful that you're here in the mortal world where second chances exist, where character can still develop, where choices still matter because their consequences aren't yet fixed, where death remains distant enough to ignore sometimes but close enough to add urgency to living. The Greeks gave us these myths as gifts, terrible and beautiful, asking us to consider who we're becoming, what we're creating, what will persist when everything temporary falls away and only essential nature remains. May your dreams tonight carry you to Elysium rather than Tartarus, or even the Asphodel Meadows. May you wake tomorrow with renewed commitment to living in ways that build character rather than destroy it, that create virtue rather than vice, that earn the paradise you imagine rather than the punishment you fear, and may you remember, always, that we are creating our eternal selves with every choice, every action, every moment of who we choose to be when choosing costs something. Good night. Wherever you find yourself in this vast world, at whatever hour these words reach you, may you rest peacefully, dream beautifully, and wake ready to live with the full awareness that existence has weight, that choices matter, that we are becoming something permanent even in this temporary realm, and that the ancient Greeks, for all their distance from us in time and belief, understood something profound about what it means to be human, to choose, to suffer consequences, and to create meaning from the raw material of existence. Sleep well, dear listeners, and may your journey through these myths enrich your journey through life.